when Morty was very young, so young that his shoes still made that hollow clap against kitchen tiles, and his voice still cracked like a bird testing its wings. He used to sit by the window at night. He didn't know why he liked it so much. He just felt drawn there, as though the glass itself whispered to him, telling him to come closer, to press his small hands against it, and look beyond. The backyard stretched outward, nothing more than a patch of grass, and a fence that sagged a little in the middle. But above that, above the crooked wooden posts and the quiet neighborhood lights, was the sky. It wasn't just stars to him, not even then. The way some children saw faces in clouds, Morty heard voices in the constellations. It wasn't language, not exactly, more like soft syllables, a cadence without meaning, but filled with feeling. He never told anyone. He didn't think it was something worth saying aloud. How could he? His parents were already busy enough with their own battles, their own silences. And Rick was always a storm in the house, coming and going, filling the rooms with a kind of restless gravity. Morty learned early that Rick spoke the loudest, but the stars spoke the gentlest. Sometimes, lying awake in bed, he would hear it again, the faint hum, the slow rise and fall of something impossible, like an old lullaby remembered from before birth. He tried to cover his ears once, just to test himself. But the sound wasn't in his ears, it was inside him, quiet as breath. He didn't know whether to be scared of it or comforted by it. Both, maybe, because along with the calm it gave, there was also a weight, like he had been chosen to carry something no one else could. He would close his eyes and imagine that each star was a candle someone had placed just for him. He imagined entire worlds, each flickering light a story waiting to be told. The whispers came strongest when he did that, as though the stars were grateful for his attention. He would sit there until sleep pulled him away, forehead resting against the cold glass, the night filling him with quiet things he didn't yet understand. Rick noticed once, though Morty hadn't realized it at the time. The boy had crept to the window again, hugging his knees, eyes wide and far away. Rick walked by with a bottle in his hand, his lab coat brushing the frame. He didn't stop, not really. Just muttered, "Careful what you listen to, kid. Not everything out there's friendly." His voice was half warning, half dismissal. But Morty remembered the way Rick's eyes lingered a fraction longer than usual, as though he too knew something about the weight of stars. From then on, Morty wondered if Rick had heard them once, when he was younger, before the world hardened him. The thought made Morty ache in a way he couldn't name. If Rick had forgotten how to hear them, then maybe Morty had to remember for both of them. The older he grew, the more it stayed with him. At school, while the teacher's words droned on about fractions or history dates, Morty would glance out the window and catch a gleam in the sky even in daylight. Sometimes he swore the whisper followed him there too, hidden beneath the ordinary noises of pencils scratching and pages turning. It never made him feel crazy. Instead, it gave him the strangest sense of belonging, as though he was part of something he couldn't yet see. But it wasn't always gentle. Some nights the whispers grew heavier, almost mournful. He would feel his chest tighten like someone was asking for help, far away, their voice broken by distance. Morty would curl deeper into his blankets, whispering back without words, only feelings, comfort, warmth, the soft promise that they weren't alone. He didn't know if the stars could hear him, but sending those feelings out made him feel lighter, as if the exchange was real. One night, a particularly dark night, when the moon hid itself and the house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator, Morty heard something clearer than ever before, not just tone, not just rhythm. A word, only one, his name. "Ah, Morty!" He froze, his whole body going still, breath shallow. It wasn't Rick's voice or his mom's or anyone he knew. It was tender, slow, like someone calling to him from a great distance. The sound wasn't frightening, it was sorrowful and sweet at the same time, as though whoever spoke it was both missing him and protecting him. After that, he couldn't stop returning to the window. Every chance he got, he'd sneak a glance at the sky, listening. And though he never heard his name that clearly again, the feeling never left him. It became his secret ritual, an anchor in a childhood where so much felt uncertain. Sometimes, when Rick dragged him on wild, chaotic adventures, Morty found himself stealing quiet moments to look up at alien skies, and no matter where he was, no matter how far they had traveled, he always felt the same hum, the same whisper beneath the stars. Different worlds, different constellations, but the same secret comfort threading them together. He didn't tell Rick. He didn't tell Summer, not even his mom. It was his. A private inheritance from the universe itself. A quiet gift, or maybe a quiet burden. Something that both soothed him and set him apart. And as Morty drifted to sleep that night, forehead pressed to the cool window pane, the last thing he felt was the rhythm of those whispers wrapping around him like an invisible blanket. A lullaby not sung by any human voice, but by the sky itself. He didn't know then how deeply it would shape him. He only knew that when the stars spoke, he listened. And listening somehow made him feel less alone. Rick never asked Morty about the nights by the window, and Morty never offered to explain. Yet the silence between them carried its own weight, as though Rick had noticed more than he let on. Morty carried that memory with him, the gruff warning about listening to the stars, and it grew into a quiet question that followed him through the years. What did Rick know about listening, and why did it sound like regret when he spoke of it? Morty often thought of it when he heard his grandfather moving about the garage late at night. The soft clatter of glass, the occasional hiss of some strange machine, and Rick's low muttering drifted through the walls like another kind of lullaby, only sharper, colder. Sometimes Morty lay awake, hearing both songs at once, the stars whispering through the window and Rick's inventions humming through the floorboards. They almost seemed to speak to each other, and Morty, lying between them, felt like the bridge. Rick was everywhere and nowhere in the house. He came in with the smell of metal and alcohol, leaving streaks of strange colors on the counters, trailing the remnants of experiments no one else understood. He would sit at the table in the morning with eyes red and heavy, drawing schematics on napkins while Beth tried to talk to him about family dinners. Morty, watching from across the table, often wondered if Rick even saw him. And yet there were moments, fleeting, rare, when Morty caught something soft in his grandfather's gaze, a pause in the scribbling, a hand that trembled before steadying, a silence that seemed full of unspoken things. Those were the moments Morty remembered most. Not the shouting, not the chaos, not even the wild adventures that made his heart race and his mind spin. No, what stayed with him were the shadows in Rick's eyes, the hints of something broken that Rick pretended wasn't there. Morty didn't know what it meant, but he knew it mattered. And in his own way, he listened to Rick the same way he listened to the stars. Not for the words, but for the feelings hidden beneath them. One evening, when the sun had already slipped below the horizon and the house smelled faintly of Beth's cooking, Morty wandered into the garage. He hadn't meant to, he just felt pulled, the same way he felt drawn to the window at night. Rick was bent over a bench cluttered with wires and glowing glass. His silhouette was sharp against the dim light, shoulders hunched, breath uneven. Morty thought he looked tired, older than usual. Rick noticed him after a moment, glancing up with a quick flicker of irritation. "Morty, what are you doing in here? You're going to break something just by standing around with that blank look." Morty shifted his weight, not sure what to say. He wanted to tell Rick about the stars, about the whispers, about how sometimes it felt like the universe itself was trying to speak through him. But the words stuck in his throat. Rick wouldn't believe him, or worse, he would believe him, and then dismiss it as useless. So Morty just shrugged, mumbling something about being curious. Rick snorted, returning to his work. "Curiosity's dangerous. Gets you into messes you can't crawl out of. Best to ignore half of what you wonder about." But Morty lingered anyway. He leaned against the cluttered counter, watching the tools sparkle faintly under the hanging bulb. He listened not to the words Rick spoke, but to the pauses between them. And in those pauses he heard something that reminded him of the night sky. A faint hum of sorrow, a weight carried too long. For weeks after, Morty replayed that small encounter in his mind. It felt like a piece of the puzzle, though he didn't yet know what the picture was. Rick was a genius, everyone said so, a man who could bend worlds, who had outwitted death more than once. But Morty had begun to suspect that genius wasn't the whole story. Beneath it was something lonelier, something heavier, something Rick never wanted anyone to see. And so Morty watched. He didn't mean to spy, but he noticed things others didn't. How Rick avoided eye contact when Beth asked about his past, how his hands sometimes shook when he poured another drink, how late at night, when the garage was silent and the stars hummed above, Rick would stand outside alone, staring at the sky with an expression Morty couldn't name. It was in those moments Morty wondered if Rick had heard the same whispers once, long ago. Maybe he had. Maybe the stars had spoken to him too, and whatever they said had left a wound. Morty never asked, but he carried the thought like a fragile flame. It connected them, even if Rick didn't know it. The whispers from the stars grew stronger during those years. Not louder exactly, more insistent, more present, weaving themselves into the rhythm of Morty's days. Sometimes he would hear them faintly, even at school, like the murmur of an old song under his breath. He tried to focus on the lessons, but his thoughts would drift, and he would catch himself wondering if anyone else could hear it too. Yet every time he looked around, his classmates were caught in their own little worlds, untouched by the same strange comfort. Rick felt different. Morty could sense it. The way he carried himself, the way he reacted when Morty lingered too long by the window or gazed up at alien skies. It was as if Rick recognized the look in his eyes but chose not to speak of it. One night, Rick found Morty on the porch, staring upward. The stars were sharp and clear, and the air was cool. Morty jumped when Rick spoke. "You're listening again, huh?" Rick's voice was rough, not unkind, but distant. Morty hesitated. "Listening to what?" Rick's eyes narrowed, the corners of his mouth twitching with something like amusement or sadness. "Doesn't matter, just don't let it get to you. Some things out there, once you hear 'em, you can't unhear 'em." Morty wanted to ask more, but Rick had already turned away, disappearing into the garage like a shadow retreating from the light. That night, as Morty lay in bed, he thought about the warning. It didn't frighten him, not exactly. It made him curious and a little sad. Because if Rick had once heard the same whispers, then maybe they were both carrying the same secret burden, only in different ways. Morty with wonder, Rick with weariness. The house settled into silence around him. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked softly, and through the window came the faint, familiar whispers of the stars. Morty closed his eyes and let them wash over him. He felt the same mixture of comfort and weight, of love and longing. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered if Rick was lying awake too, listening in his own way. Morty couldn't stop thinking about Rick's words that night on the porch. He lay in bed with the blanket pulled to his chin, staring into the faint glow of the ceiling, his ears full of that soft, cosmic murmur. The warning had been simple enough, don't let it get to you, but it was the way Rick had said it, the way his voice seemed to carry memory, that kept Morty restless. There had been no mockery in it, no sharp edge of sarcasm, just a heaviness that felt out of place, coming from someone who claimed not to care about anything. It was as though Rick had once heard the same whispers and had been changed by them, wounded in a way Morty couldn't yet understand. As sleep began to pull him under, something else rose to meet him. A song. It was faint at first, half-formed, like the hum of an old record player with the volume turned low. The tune was slow, repeating, carrying a sadness wrapped in warmth. Morty had the strange certainty that he had heard it before, though he couldn't remember when or where. It wasn't Rick's voice, nor his mum's, nor anyone familiar. It felt older than that, gentler, like a memory he had been born with. The lullaby seemed to blend with the whispers of the stars, as if they were two parts of the same language. When he woke, the song lingered. He could almost hum it, though the melody slipped through his grasp like water through cupped hands. At breakfast, he caught himself staring at his bowl of cereal, lips moving faintly with the tune that wasn't there. Summer raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Rick glanced up from a piece of toast covered with something glowing faintly blue, then looked away. Morty wondered, just for a second, if Rick had recognized it too. The day passed in a haze. Lessons at school felt distant, like he was only half present. Each time he tried to focus, the lullaby nudged at him, tugging him back toward itself. It wasn't intrusive, though, it was comforting, like the hand of someone unseen guiding him forward. By the time he returned home, the melody had folded itself into his thoughts so completely that he could no longer tell if he was remembering it or inventing it. That night, Morty returned to the window. The stars burned cold and clear, the kind of night sky that looked sharper than glass. He pressed his forehead to the pane, waiting, listening. And slowly, gently, the whispers returned. But this time, they weren't alone. Threaded through them was that same lullaby, faint but steady, carrying him into stillness. He mouthed the sound without realizing, shaping his lips to the rhythm. And for a moment, something remarkable happened. The stars seemed to answer. The lights above shimmered, a pulse too subtle for anyone else to notice. Morty felt it in his chest, a quiet resonance, as though the sky itself had sighed in recognition. He wasn't imagining it, he couldn't be. The lullaby became a secret companion after that. Some nights it was strong, almost clear enough to follow note by note. Other nights it was just a whisper, hidden behind the usual hum of the stars. Morty tried to hold on to it, but it was slippery, always retreating just beyond memory. Still, he knew it belonged to him in some way. It felt less like something he had discovered and more like something he had been given long ago. One evening, while Rick tinkered in the garage, Morty hovered in the doorway. He wanted to ask about the song, about whether Rick had ever heard music in the sky. But Rick's back was to him, shoulders bent, tools clattering in a rhythm that seemed deliberately loud. Morty opened his mouth, then closed it again. He knew what Rick would say, that it was just his imagination, that the universe didn't sing lullabies, But deep down, Morty suspected Rick wouldn't mean it. Rick might even know the tune, though he'd never admit it. The house grew quieter in those days. Beth was often distracted with her work, Jerry with his small battles of pride. Summer slipped in and out with her own teenage storms. Morty, left to himself, leaned further into his strange inheritance. The lullaby became his anchor, a soft reminder that he was never truly alone, even when no one else noticed him. He began to hum it softly under his breath when he felt nervous or overwhelmed. At school, when a test paper loomed in front of him, or when other kids whispered behind his back, the tune steadied him. It was like carrying a secret shield. He didn't need to understand its words, if there even were any, because the feeling was enough. It told him he was seen, that somewhere, somehow, he mattered. One night, the song shifted. It grew clearer, more vivid, filling his head so completely he thought someone must be standing in the room, singing it. He turned, heart pounding, but the room was empty. Still the sound went on, wrapping him like a blanket. And then, just as it had with the whispers before, the voice spoke a word, his name. Morty. The same sorrow, the same tenderness as before, but this time carried on melody. His throat tightened. He whispered back into the darkness, not sure if he was speaking aloud or just in his mind. "Who are you?" No answer came, but the song went on. And even though his question was unanswered, Morty didn't feel abandoned. He felt chosen, in a way. As though the song itself was waiting for him to grow into its meaning. In the days that followed, he noticed himself listening differently to the world. The hum of the refrigerator, the buzz of streetlights, even the rustle of leaves in the wind, they all seemed to echo fragments of that same lullaby. It was as though the melody had stitched itself into the fabric of reality, hidden in plain sound. And Morty, by some quiet miracle, was the only one who could hear it. He never told Rick. He wanted to more than once. The way Rick sometimes lingered on the porch, staring up, convinced Morty that Rick knew more than he admitted. But every time Morty tried to speak, the words tangled in his throat. Maybe it wasn't time yet. Maybe the lullaby was meant to remain secret until he was ready to understand it fully. So Morty kept it close, humming softly when no one was near, listening when the stars shimmered. It was a memory that didn't quite belong to him, yet lived inside him as though it had always been there. A forgotten song calling him toward something he couldn't name, something that waited just beyond the reach of understanding. And as he lay in bed once more, drifting toward sleep with the tune circling gently in his chest, Morty felt the same unshakable truth he always did. The universe was speaking to him in its own way, and one day he would know why. The lullaby followed Morty into his dreams. At first, it was just a faint echo carried into sleep, the kind of sound that felt more like a memory than a song. But slowly, night after night, it began to form a setting, a place that seemed to exist only when his eyes were closed. He found himself walking down a long hallway, its walls pale and endless, the air hushed as though the whole world was holding its breath. The melody floated somewhere ahead of him, never too loud, never too far. He followed it because he had no choice, because something in him trusted it completely. The hallway stretched on without corners, without doors, just a steady path forward. Yet at the farthest point, where the light seemed to bend and soften, there was always a door, tall, plain, wooden, with no markings to tell him what lay beyond. He tried the handle more than once, small hand, trembling, but it was locked every time. The lullaby would swell softly as he reached for it, then fall silent, as his fingers tightened around the knob. That silence filled him with both longing and fear. He would stand there, pressing his ear to the wood, hoping to catch even the faintest sound from the other side. But all he heard was his own heartbeat, steady and lonely in the dream's stillness. Every time he woke, the memory of the hallway lingered longer. At breakfast, he would stare at his cereal spoon, tracing the reflections in the milk, as if they might reveal what was behind the dream door. At school, he caught himself doodling the shape of it on notebook paper, sketching the curve of the knob, the way the light pooled around the frame. He didn't tell anyone, not even Rick. The dream felt too personal, too delicate to risk losing by speaking it aloud. The more he dreamed it, the more real it became. The texture of the walls, smooth yet cold beneath his fingertips, the faint hum in the floor as if the ground itself was alive. Sometimes he thought he could hear whispers, not from the stars this time, but from behind the door, faint and broken, like someone calling through a thick fog. Each time he pressed closer, straining to hear, the dream would dissolve and he would jolt awake, heart pounding, mouth dry. Morty didn't know if the door frightened him or comforted him. It was both. The fear came from the unknown of it, the sense that whatever waited inside could change him forever. The comfort came from its constancy. The hallway was always there, night after night, unchanging. It became an anchor, a place where he could return, even when his waking world felt scattered and uncertain. Rick noticed something was different, though Morty never mentioned the dreams. One afternoon, while Morty sat at the kitchen table, absently humming the lullaby, Rick glanced at him from the sink. His brow furrowed, and for a moment Morty thought he might say something, but Rick only muttered under his breath and turned away. Morty wondered if Rick recognized the tune, if it stirred something half buried in him too. The thought filled Morty with a strange mix of sadness and connection, as though they were both carrying secrets they couldn't share. The dream grew stronger over time. The hallway stretched further, the light at the end glowing brighter. The door remained locked, but the presence behind it grew clearer. Sometimes Morty thought he could feel warmth seeping through the wood, like someone pressing their palm against the other side. Once he even thought he heard a voice, not his name this time, but a low murmur, tender and sorrowful, impossible to understand, yet filled with meaning. He woke with tears on his cheeks, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming closeness of it. The days that followed carried a quiet weight. Morty found himself glancing at ordinary doors around the house, wondering if they too led somewhere hidden. He traced the wood grain with his fingers, leaned his ear against them when no one was watching. Nothing happened, of course, but still the habit grew, a ritual born of the dream's lingering grip. One evening, Summer found him staring too long at the door to the basement. "What are you doing?" she asked, her tone skeptical but curious. Morty blinked, startled, then shook his head. "Nothing, just thinking." She rolled her eyes and walked away, but Morty lingered a moment longer, listening. For an instant, so brief he thought he imagined it, he swore he heard the faintest hum, the same vibration that filled the dream hallway. He pulled away quickly, unsettled, yet drawn closer at the same time. That night, when the dream came again, the door was different. It was still closed, still locked, but the knob turned slightly under his touch, as if whoever was behind it had tried to open it too. Morty's breath caught. He pressed his forehead against the wood, whispering into the silence. "Who are you?" His voice echoed strangely, as though the hallway itself had repeated it back to him. Then the dream dissolved, leaving him awake in the dark, his pulse racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that the dream wasn't only his, that someone, or something, was meeting him halfway. The thought filled him with wonder, but also with a responsibility he didn't yet know how to carry. Rick's words returned to him, the warning about listening too closely. Morty began to wonder if this door was what Rick had meant all along. Perhaps Rick had stood before it once too, heard the whispers, felt the warmth. Maybe Rick had chosen to turn away, to bury it under science and cynicism. Morty didn't know, but he knew he couldn't turn away. The dream wasn't just a dream anymore. It was part of him, as real as the lullaby, as constant as the stars. He carried it with him into the waking world, humming the tune softly, sketching the outline of the door in the margins of his notebooks. The more he did, the stronger the pull became, as though acknowledging it made it more real. He began to wonder if the day would come when the dream and waking world would overlap, when the door would appear before him fully, waiting. And though he didn't know what he would find behind it, he knew with a quiet certainty that he would not be able to resist. Whatever waited beyond was part of his hidden story, the thread of destiny woven through his quiet life. That night, as he drifted once again into the long, pale hallway, he placed his hand on the knob and whispered a promise into the silence. "I'll keep coming back." And the lullaby, steady and sorrowful, seemed to answer. Morning light crept across Morty's room like a slow tide, brushing against his eyelids until he blinked awake. For a moment he just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to hold on to the last fragile threads of the dream. The hallway, the door, the knob that had turned, almost, just almost, giving way beneath his hand. His chest tightened at the memory. He whispered the lullaby under his breath, so softly it barely carried beyond his lips, as if afraid the silence itself might swallow it. The house was unusually still. Downstairs, the hum of appliances and the occasional rattle of utensils made it clear someone was in the kitchen. Morty dragged himself out of bed, the dream still clinging to him like dew, and padded down the hall. He found Rick hunched over the counter, building a sandwich with the distracted air of someone who wasn't really hungry but needed the act of eating to occupy his hands. Morty froze for a second at the doorway, watching. The sharp smell of pickles hung in the air, mixed with the faintest burn of something chemical. Rick must have been tinkering with some experiment before shifting his attention to food. "Morning," Morty muttered. Rick didn't look up. "It's not morning. It's a meaningless collection of photons arranged at a particular angle relative to this planet's arbitrary rotation. Don't romanticize it." His voice was flat, but Morty could hear something underneath it, a tiredness, maybe even avoidance. Morty slid into a chair and sat quietly. The sound of Rick's knife against the bread seemed louder than it should have. The silence stretched, and Morty found himself tracing little shapes with his finger on the table, the shape of a door without meaning to. Rick noticed. "What's that?" Rick asked suddenly, glancing up. Morty froze, pulling his hand back. "Nothing. Just doodling." Rick narrowed his eyes, staring at him long enough to make Morty squirm. For a second, Morty thought he might press further, but instead Rick only shrugged and went back to his sandwich. "Doodling's fine, just don't let doodles become obsessions. That's how you end up with conspiracy theorists and cult leaders, or worse, scientists." He smirked faintly at his own joke, but it didn't reach his eyes. Morty felt a flicker of frustration. He wanted to say something, to ask if Rick had ever heard the lullaby, if he'd ever stood before the dream door, but the words tangled in his throat. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, thick, almost humming, as if something unspoken stretched between them. Rick finally set the sandwich down and leaned on the counter, staring at Morty. "You been quiet lately? Quieter than usual, I mean. What's in that head of yours?" Morty swallowed hard. His heart beat faster, torn between confession and retreat. The dream burned at the edges of his mind, desperate to be shared. But the memory of Rick's warning about listening too closely, about things that couldn't be undone, kept him still. He forced a shaky laugh. It's nothing, Rick. Just school stuff." Rick didn't look convinced. He studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly, as though he'd made some private decision not to pry further. "School stuff, right. Well, don't let school rot your brain more than it already has." He grabbed the sandwich, muttered something under his breath, and shuffled out of the kitchen. Morty sat there for a long time after, staring at the crumbs on the counter, the faint circle his finger had traced on the table. He realized that even in silence he couldn't escape the pull of the dream. It lived in him now, as steady as breath. That night, the door came sooner. The hallway no longer stretched endlessly. It seemed to narrow, funneling him forward faster than before. His footsteps echoed, each one pulling him closer to the frame. The knob gleamed faintly as though catching light from an unseen source. This time, when he reached for it, the metal was warm under his hand. He twisted it carefully, heart pounding. It turned further than it ever had before, until he felt the faintest give, the suggestion that the door might finally open. But before he could push, a sound rippled through the air. It wasn't the lullaby, it was Rick's voice. Morty froze, eyes wide. Rick's voice was muffled, distorted by distance, but unmistakable. He was saying something, though Morty couldn't make out the words. The tone was low, almost pleading. Morty pressed his ear to the wood, straining, desperate to hear. The knob trembled faintly under his grip, as if someone on the other side was holding it too. He whispered into the silence. "Rick?" The dream dissolved instantly. Morty gasped awake in his bed, sweat cooling on his skin. The house was silent again, but the memory of Rick's voice lingered, heavy and inescapable. Over the following days, Morty couldn't look at Rick the same way. Every casual remark, every muttered complaint carried the echo of that voice behind the door. He began to wonder if Rick knew, if he remembered standing where Morty stood now. Maybe the lullaby, the hallway, the locked door. Maybe it was something inherited, passed down like a shadow or a scar. One evening, Morty tried again. He lingered near Rick in the garage, pretending to watch him work. The air was thick with the smell of solder and ozone. Rick was busy with some strange contraption, sparks snapping as he adjusted the wiring. Morty hesitated, then asked softly, "Do you ever hear things? At night?" Rick froze just slightly, his hand hovering over a circuit. The pause was barely noticeable, but Morty caught it. Then Rick cleared his throat, adjusting his grip. "All the time. Usually neighbors arguing about their miserable lives. Why? You hearing voices? Should I get you checked for psychosis?" Morty's mouth went dry. He wanted to push, to ask if Rick had ever dreamed of a door, but the wall between them was thick, built from years of unspoken things. He only shook his head. Number just wondering. Rick gave him a sharp look, but said nothing more. That night the dream came again. This time the knob turned smoothly in Morty's hand, swinging the door open just enough to let out a breath of warm air that carried with it the faintest trace of a familiar scent, something like ozone and alcohol. He stepped forward, heart racing, but the moment his foot crossed the threshold, the dream collapsed into darkness, and he woke with a sharp cry that echoed in the still room. The silence afterward was suffocating. He sat up in bed, hands trembling, and for the first time he wasn't sure if he wanted the door to open again. Morty lay awake long after the last fragments of the dream had dissolved, staring at the ceiling as though it might answer him. The echo of Rick's voice behind that door pressed against his mind, refusing to fade. It wasn't just the sound of Rick speaking. It was the tone, unfamiliar and fragile, almost as though he'd been begging. That was what unsettled Morty most. Rick never begged, not in waking life. The following day, Morty felt the distance between them more keenly than ever. At breakfast, Rick's usual sarcasm seemed like armor, every joke a shield against something deeper. Morty tried to catch his eye, but Rick avoided his gaze, muttering about needing to get back to the garage. Summer scrolled idly on her phone, oblivious. Beth was distracted with work. No one else seemed to notice the strange gravity that had settled over the house. Morty felt like he was carrying it alone. He wandered outside later, the air cool against his skin. The sky was pale, not yet dark, but the first faint stars were blinking into being. Almost without thinking, Morty tilted his head back. The old hum returned, faint whispers threading through the silence. It was gentler than before, but more insistent, as though urging him forward. He closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. This time, though, he tried something different. He whispered back, "What do you want from me?" His voice barely reached past his lips, but the air seemed to ripple in response. The hum deepened, stretching, shaping itself into something almost like words. Morty's heart leapt. He strained to listen, but just as the sound began to coalesce, Rick's voice cut across the yard. "Morty, get in here, it's late!" The whispers snapped off, vanishing like mist. Morty's eyes flew open, his chest tight. He turned to see Rick standing in the doorway, shadowed by the house light, a silhouette with shoulders just slightly hunched. For an instant Morty thought Rick's eyes seemed tired in a way that had nothing to do with science or alcohol. But then Rick turned away, and the image slipped back into the ordinary. That night, the dream returned, stronger than ever. The hallway was shorter now, almost direct, the door waiting like it had always known he would come. Morty's hand trembled as he reached out. The knob was warm again, steady beneath his palm. He twisted it, and this time the door swung open wide. The air rushed past him, thick with the same ozone and alcohol scent, and Morty stepped through before he could hesitate. The space beyond wasn't a room, not exactly. It was more like a memory made solid, a laboratory cluttered with tools, glowing machines humming faintly in the dark. Morty turned slowly, his pulse racing. He knew this place, though he couldn't say how. And then he saw him. Rick, not the Rick of now, but a younger version. His hair was less wild, his posture less bent. He was hunched over a table, scribbling furiously, muttering under his breath. The words came in fragments, pieces of equations, curses, and, Morty froze, lines of the lullaby. Rick's voice cracked as he sang it softly to himself, almost like a charm against the silence. Morty's throat closed. He took a step forward, but the floor shifted under his feet, rippling like water. The younger Rick didn't notice him. Instead, he slammed his pen down and buried his face in his hands. For a moment, the illusion fractured. Morty saw flashes of something else behind it. A child's room, a crib, shadows stretching long across the floor, and always the lullaby threading through. The ground lurched, and Morty stumbled. The door behind him swung shut with a sharp thud. Panic gripped him. He ran to it, pulling, but the knob wouldn't budge. He turned back, just as the younger Rick lifted his head, eyes wide and hollow, staring directly at him. "You shouldn't be here." The words were quiet, but they carried like thunder. Morty's breath caught. "Rick," he whispered. The image flickered, breaking apart, and the voice shifted. It wasn't quite Rick's anymore. It was layered, echoes upon echoes, older than his grandfather, older than him. "You open what cannot be closed. You inherit what you cannot bear." The floor split. Darkness swallowed the lab, the machines, even the younger Rick, until Morty was falling through endless void. He screamed, but the sound was snatched away by the wind. The lullaby rose up to meet him, no longer gentle but vast, endless, overwhelming. He jolted awake, gasping, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. His chest heaved as he stared around the room, disoriented. Everything looked normal, yet his hands still shook as though the dream clung to him physically. He tried to steady his breathing, but then he heard it. Not from the stars, not from the dream. From the hallway outside his room. Soft, low, unmistakable, the lullaby. Morty froze, his blood turning cold. Each note was fragile, almost broken, but it carried with the weight of memory. He slipped out of bed and pressed his ear to the door. The sound was faint, drifting down the hall. He followed it, step by careful step, until he reached the garage. The door was cracked open, light spilling in a thin line across the floor. Morty pushed it open slowly. Rick was there, hunched over the workbench, but he wasn't working. His tools lay scattered, forgotten. A bottle sat half empty beside him, and from his lips came the song, slurred but steady, the same lullaby that had haunted Morty's dreams. Morty's heart pounded. The sound was almost too much to bear, confirmation that it wasn't just in his head, that the dream wasn't just his own. He stepped closer, voice shaking. "Rick, where did you learn that?" Rick froze mid-note, shoulders stiffening. For a long, unbearable moment, he didn't move. Then slowly he turned his head, meeting Morty's wide eyes. There was no smirk, no sarcasm, only a hollow weariness that made Morty feel suddenly small. Rick's mouth opened like he might speak, but instead he looked away, swallowing hard. "Go to bed, Morty." The words were sharp, final, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Morty wanted to argue, to push, to demand answers, but something in Rick's expression stopped him cold, the kind of pain that was too raw to touch. He backed away slowly, retreating into the quiet of the hallway. But as he lay awake later, staring at the ceiling, the truth pressed in on him. The lullaby was not just his burden. It was Rick's too. And whatever lay behind that door, they were both bound to it. Morty barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Rick at the bench, his lips moving around the tune like he had been carrying it for decades. Morty replayed the moment over and over, the way Rick's shoulders had tensed when he realized Morty was listening, the way his voice cracked with something too raw to be disguised by a joke. By morning, Morty's head throbbed from lack of rest, but his resolve had sharpened. He needed answers. Rick, of course, pretended nothing had happened. He moved around the kitchen in his usual jittery rhythm, cracking eggs, tinkering with some tiny device, as though multitasking was a defense against silence. His hair was even more unkempt than usual, and the smell of alcohol still clung faintly to him, though he hid it under the sharp tang of coffee. Morty sat stiffly at the table, watching him, waiting. "You gonna stare at me all day, Morty, or do you want toast?" Rick muttered without looking up. Morty hesitated, then blurted, "I heard you." Rick froze just slightly, enough for Morty to notice. "Heard me what?" "The song," Morty pressed. His voice came out shakier than he'd intended, but he forced himself to keep going. "You were singing it. The same one from my dreams. The same one I've been hearing in my head." Rick's hand tightened around the spatula until his knuckles whitened. For a moment, Morty thought he might snap, deflect, mock, or shut him down completely. But Rick only sighed, slumping slightly as if the weight of the question had already drained him. He turned off the stove and set the pan aside. "You don't want to dig in that grave, Morty," he said, his voice low. "Some things are buried for a reason." Morty's stomach knotted. "But it's not just me, right? You know it. You've known it this whole time." Rick finally looked at him, his eyes glassy but piercing. There was no anger there, no sharp edge, just exhaustion. Morty felt suddenly exposed, like he'd stepped into something too vast to comprehend. Rick rubbed his face with one hand, muttering something Morty couldn't catch, then grabbed his flask and took a long swig. "All right," Rick said at last. "You want answers? Fine. But you don't get to complain when you don't like 'em." Morty swallowed hard. Rick motioned for him to follow and headed for the garage. The familiar scent of oil, metal, and ozone hit Morty as the door closed behind them. Rick didn't sit at his workbench this time. Instead, he went straight to one of the locked cabinets at the back, the one Morty had never seen opened before. Rick pressed his hand against a hidden panel, and with a series of metallic clicks, the lock disengaged. Inside lay a small, dusty box, no larger than a shoebox. Its surface was plain, unremarkable, but Morty felt the air in the garage shift as Rick lifted it out. There was a carefulness in the way he held it, almost reverence. He placed it on the bench and opened it. Inside was an old recording device, battered and outdated, wires frayed at the edges. Rick stared at it for a long time before finally pressing a button. The machine crackled, hissed, and then... The lullaby filled the room, Morty's breath caught. It was clearer than in his dreams, delicate and haunting, sung in a voice that wasn't Rick's. It was feminine, warm, and unbearably tender. The melody wrapped around him like a memory he shouldn't have, tugging at something deep inside. Morty's chest ached as he listened. Who is that?" Morty whispered. Rick's jaw clenched. He stared at the recorder as though it were burning him. "Her name was Diane," he said finally, the words scraping out of him like it hurt to say. "Your grandmother." Morty blinked, stunned. He had heard stories, fragments, but Beth never talked about her mother, and Rick almost never spoke her name. Now, hearing it tied to this melody, it was like a puzzle piece falling into place, only to reveal a picture he wasn't ready for. "That's her singing?" Morty asked, his voice trembling. Rick nodded slowly. His eyes were far away, fixed on the device. "She used to sing it to Beth. Every night. And later?" His voice broke, and he stopped, swallowing hard. "Later to someone else." Morty frowned. "Someone else?" Rick didn't answer right away. Instead, he shut off the recorder abruptly, the silence hitting like a slap. He shoved the box aside, pacing the length of the garage. Morty felt his heartbeat quicken as he watched his grandfather unravel in real time. "There are echoes in this multiverse, Morty," Rick muttered, gesturing vaguely with his flask. "Songs, memories, patterns. They don't stay where they belong. They leak. They bleed into dreams, into places they shouldn't be. That lullaby, it doesn't just belong to her. It doesn't just belong to me. Somehow it found its way to you." "But why me?" Morty asked, his voice desperate. "Why am I dreaming about it? Why am I seeing all this stuff, these rooms, these versions of you?" Rick stopped pacing. He turned, and for once there was no wall between them, no barrier of cynicism or science, only truth, raw and brutal. "Because you're not just you, Morty. You're connected. To me, to her, to all of it. You're carrying pieces of something that never should have existed in the first place." Morty's knees felt weak. What do you mean? Connected how? Rick's mouth opened, then shut again. He dragged a hand down his face, muttering curses under his breath. Not yet, he said finally. You're not ready? Anger flared in Morty's chest. Don't say that! You can't just dangle this in front of me and pull back. I need to know, Rick. I've been losing sleep. Morty! Rick's voice cracked like a whip, sharp enough to freeze him. But Rick's expression wasn't anger. It was fear, real fear. His hands shook as he gripped the edge of the workbench, knuckles white. If I tell you everything now, it won't just change you, it'll break you. You think the dreams are bad now. You think the whispers are just some spooky bedtime tune. Number there, a call, a tether, and if you pull too hard, they'll pull back. The words sank into Morty like ice water. A tether, a call, something waiting on the other side. Rick slumped into his chair, drained, his eyes fixed on the floor. For now, just know it's not in your head. It's real, too real, and it's not done with us. Morty stood in the heavy silence, his heart hammering. He wanted to press, to scream, to demand every detail. But looking at Rick, truly looking, he saw the cracks in his grandfather's armor, the haunted lines around his eyes, the weight he carried like a wound that never healed. The questions burned on his tongue, but he swallowed them. For now. As he turned to leave the garage, Morty heard it again. Not from the recorder, not from Rick's lips, from the shadows themselves. The lullaby, faint but undeniable, threading through the air like smoke. Rick didn't react. He just raised his flask, his gaze hollow, and muttered under his breath, "It's starting again." Morty froze in the doorway, a chill racing down his spine. The song wasn't finished, and neither were they. The lullaby lingered long after Morty left the garage, an echo that clung to the walls of the house and burrowed into his chest. It followed him up the stairs, into his room, into the restless darkness where sleep refused to come. Every time his eyelids fluttered shut, the tune drifted closer, threading itself into his dreams until the boundary between thought and reality began to dissolve. At first, the dreams replayed the song exactly as he had heard it on the recorder. His grandmother's voice, warm and steady, carrying the fragile melody through static and memory. But slowly, the details shifted. The voice warped, layered, until it no longer belonged to a single person. Sometimes it was Rick, singing low and broken. Sometimes it was Morty himself, though he couldn't recall moving his lips. Other times, it was countless voices at once, weaving together like a choir that spanned beyond time. Morty jolted awake more than once, drenched in sweat, the phantom vibration of the song still rattling in his bones. The more he tried to shake it off, the heavier it grew, like gravity pulling him towards something unseen. By the third night, he stopped pretending he could ignore it. When Rick stumbled into the kitchen the next morning, bleary-eyed and carrying the smell of too many sleepless hours, Morty was already there, hunched over the table with a notebook, pages filled with scrawled notes, rough sketches of shapes and symbols he couldn't remember drawing, arrows looping across margins like frantic road maps. Rick's eyes narrowed. He set his flask on the counter with a sharp clink. "What the hell is this, Morty?" Morty didn't flinch. "I think it's trying to show me something." Rick stalked forward, snatching up one of the pages. His gaze darted across the mess of sketches, spirals, fractured lines, a crude outline of a door that Morty didn't remember drawing. Rick's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable. "You're not supposed to follow it," Rick muttered. His voice was quieter than Morty expected, edged with a strain that betrayed how badly he wanted to rip the paper to shreds. "I don't have a choice," Morty shot back. His voice cracked, but the fire in it surprised even him. It's not like I'm asking for these dreams. They won't stop. I hear it everywhere. When I'm awake, when I'm asleep. I can't turn it off, Rick. It's pulling me somewhere. And if you know what it is, then you need to tell me. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Rick's shoulders sagged, his bravado slipping like a mask too heavy to keep on. He rubbed his temple with a shaking hand. Morty, this isn't just some bad dream or psychic residue. That song isn't a memory. It's a signal, a beacon. His voice cracked on the last word, and he took another swig from the flask, as though trying to wash it away. And if it's reaching you, it means they've noticed. Morty's chest tightened. Who's they? Rick slammed the flask down, harder this time. Not yet. You don't get to know that yet. He turned away, pacing, muttering calculations under his breath, numbers Morty couldn't follow. Morty stared at him, heart pounding. Every instinct screamed at him to press harder, to demand the truth, but something in Rick's eyes warned him off. Not fear of Morty knowing, but fear of what speaking it aloud might summon. The days blurred after that. Morty found himself drifting through classes in a haze, hearing the lullaby in the faint hum of the fluorescent lights, in the static of the school's intercom, even in the rhythm of his own pulse. The song was no longer just a sound, it was a place. He could feel it now, waiting just beyond the edges of perception. By the fifth night, Morty gave up trying to resist. When the dream took him, he didn't fight it. He let the song guide him deeper. This time, the dream didn't dissolve when he realized he was dreaming. He stood in a vast corridor, its walls stretching infinitely upward, lined with doors that pulsed faintly in rhythm with the melody. The air was thick, heavy, each breath vibrating in his chest as though the corridor itself was alive. The song reverberated through the floor, the ceiling, the very marrow of his bones. He walked forward, his steps echoing in perfect time with the lullaby. Each door he passed bore symbols like the ones he had drawn in his notebook, fractured spirals, jagged crescents, shifting patterns that seemed to rearrange themselves when he looked too long. One door in particular pulled at him. Its surface was cracked, light spilling faintly through the fractures. The song swelled as he approached, every note urging him closer. When he touched the handle, the corridor shuddered. Morty gasped awake in his bed, the air around him thrumming like an engine. His hands shook, but they weren't empty. In his palm, cold and impossibly real, lay a fragment of something metallic, smooth, etched with the same shifting patterns from his dream. He stared at it, his pulse racing. The dream wasn't just in his head anymore, it was bleeding into reality. He didn't wait until morning. Morty rushed downstairs, nearly tripping over himself as he burst into the garage. Rick was there, hunched over his workbench, eyes bloodshot from too much time awake. Morty slammed the fragment down in front of him. Rick froze. His eyes darted from the shard to Morty's trembling hand. For the first time in Morty's life he saw genuine horror flash across his grandfather's face. "Morty, what did you do?" Rick's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that sank into the pit of Morty's stomach. I just touched the door," Morty stammered. "It was in the dream, Rick, but now—" Rick seized the fragment, turning it over with frantic precision. His hands shook as he muttered to himself, equations spilling out like a mantra, panic threaded through every word. Then he stopped, his eyes going glassy, his breath shallow. "They know where we are now." Morty's skin went cold. "Who? Rick? Who's they?" Rick looked at him, and for once there was no sarcasm, no armor of deflection, just raw fear. "The ones who built the song?" Before Morty could respond, The garage lights flickered. The air grew heavy, vibrating with the same resonance that had haunted his dreams. The lullaby seeped into the walls, no longer faint, no longer distant. It was here, louder, sharper, as though reality itself was beginning to sing. Rick grabbed Morty by the shoulders, his grip almost desperate. "Listen to me, Morty. No matter what happens, don't follow the song again. You hear me? Don't open another door." But Morty already knew it was too late. The song wasn't asking anymore. It was calling, and something on the other side was listening. The garage shook as if the foundations of the house itself had begun to hum with the same resonance that haunted Morty's dreams. The lights overhead flickered and buzzed, their glow sputtering into brief moments of darkness before flaring back with a harsh, sterile glare. The fragment in Rick's hand pulsed faintly, each beat aligned perfectly with the rhythm of the lullaby that now filled the air. It wasn't coming from the recorder anymore, nor from some hidden speaker. It was in the walls, in the concrete, in their very bones. Rick cursed under his breath and dropped the shard onto the workbench as if it had burned him. The metal piece rattled across the surface, but didn't settle. It kept vibrating, tiny movements in time with the invisible song. Morty couldn't tear his eyes from it. The markings carved into its surface seemed to writhe, rearranging themselves in impossible patterns whenever he tried to focus on them. "Rick," Morty whispered, his voice shaking. It's the same as the door." "Don't say it!" Rick snapped, his voice sharp with panic. He grabbed a heavy containment field generator from a shelf and slammed it down over the shard. The machine hissed to life, bathing the fragment in a field of shimmering distortion. For a second, the resonance dimmed, the song muffled, but then, impossibly, the humming adapted, its pitch bending until it bled right through the containment field, louder than before. Rick's face went pale. He muttered equations under his breath, hands flying across tools and instruments, his movements erratic but desperate. Morty had seen him build weapons in seconds, inventions in minutes, machines that defied reality without breaking a sweat. But now every action was frantic, unsteady, as though even Rick's genius was being outpaced by whatever force had awakened. Morty stepped back, pressing himself against the wall as the vibration thickened. It wasn't just sound anymore, it was pressure, a weight pushing against his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. His vision blurred at the edges, lights warping into shapes that bent and twisted into spirals. The shard glowed faintly beneath the containment field. A crack formed in the distortion itself, splitting open like a hairline fracture in glass. Morty's voice came out hoarse, nearly drowned beneath the sound. "Rick, it's breaking through!" Rick spun, his face grim. He shoved Morty toward the far corner of the garage. "Don't move, don't speak, don't think about the song. Just hold on." Morty froze, his heart hammering in his ears, but holding still didn't help. The melody threaded into his thoughts, pulling memories to the surface that he had never lived, moments that couldn't belong to him. He saw fields of black glass beneath skies threaded with gold, towers that pulsed with light instead of stone, voices chanting the lullaby in tones that shook the stars themselves. He wasn't just hearing the song anymore, he was inside it. The crack in the containment field widened with a sharp, electric hiss. Sparks flared as the generator strained, the metal casing groaning under pressure. The shard lifted from the workbench, hovering weightlessly, its glow swelling until it was almost blinding. Rick ripped cables from the wall, jamming them into the generator, rerouting power directly from the house. Lights dimmed across the garage, plunging everything into shadow, except the unbearable glow of the shard. His voice broke as he barked, "I told you, Morty!" "I told you not to touch it." The hum deepened into a low, resonant tone that rattled their teeth. Morty clutched his head, tears streaming down his face as the visions intensified. He saw door after door stretching into infinity, each one cracked open, each one leaking fragments of the lullaby. Shapes moved behind them, shadows vast and unknowable, bending their forms against thresholds that were never meant to open. "Rick!" Morty gasped, his voice raw. They're coming through!" Rick's hands froze mid-motion, his tools clattering to the floor. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting Morty's, and in them was something Morty had never seen before. Resignation. The generator gave a final sputter before collapsing with a sharp pop. The containment field shattered, shards of distorted light spraying into the air like broken glass. The shard itself flared brilliantly, and for a moment Morty could see through it as though it were a window. On the other side was not another room, nor another dimension he could comprehend. It was a void, infinite and alive, its fabric rippling with voices that merged into the lullaby. A presence pressed against the fracture, vast and suffocating, its edges defined only by absence. It leaned forward, curious, as if finally noticing the two fragile figures staring back. Rick lunged, seizing the shard in his bare hands. The glow seared into his skin, but he didn't let go. His jaw clenched, sweat pouring down his face as he pulled every ounce of will into forcing it shut. Sparks burned across his arms, scorching his lab coat. His body trembled under the strain, every vein in his neck standing out as though he were wrestling a god. "Morty, listen to me!" Rick's voice was guttural, raw, each word scraped from the bottom of his lungs. "This is bigger than you, bigger than me. If they breach, if they get through, there's no universe left to run to, you understand? Nothing." Morty's chest heaved, terror stealing his words. He wanted to run, to shut his eyes, to pretend none of this was happening, but the song anchored him, refusing to let him look away. And in that instant he realized something terrible. The presence wasn't pushing its way through, it was waiting. The shard wasn't a lock being forced open, it was a door being offered. And Morty had already opened it. The lullaby swelled, filling every corner of his mind. His knees buckled, and he crumpled to the floor, hands pressed against his ears, though it did nothing to muffle the sound. Through the ringing, he heard Rick screaming, not at him, but at the shard itself, words twisted into equations, into curses, into prayers that Morty couldn't understand. Light exploded across the garage. For one brief, endless moment, Morty saw it clearly. A face, or something like a face, pressed against the fracture. Not human, not alien, but a convergence of endless forms, features shifting faster than thought could process. Its eyes, or the suggestion of them, fell on him, and the song bent, reshaped, its notes twisting into something directed, personal. It was singing to him. The vision broke as Rick slammed a device against the shard. A pulse of violet energy erupted, engulfing the garage in a concussive wave that hurled Morty backward into the wall. The hum cut off instantly. The light died. The shard, now blackened and cracked, fell to the floor with a dull clink. Morty gasped, his chest heaving, his ears ringing with silence that felt heavier than the song itself. Rick collapsed against the workbench, his hands scorched, his breath ragged. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and burnt metal, smoke curling up from the ruined machines. Finally, Morty whispered, his voice trembling. "Rick, what was that?" Rick lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale. When he spoke, it was barely audible. "Not what, Morty? Who?" Morty shivered. He couldn't bring himself to ask more. He already knew, deep down, that whatever had looked at him wasn't gone. It had seen him. And now that it had, it would never forget. Morty barely slept that night. Every time his eyes closed, he was dragged back into the song, the melody unraveling like a thread that bound him to something endless and waiting. He tossed and turned in the dim light of his room, the faint glow of the hallway leaking through the door. The silence pressed down heavier than the hum ever had, and that was what frightened him most. The absence wasn't peace, it was anticipation, something patient, deliberate, watching him from the other side of every shadow. He tried to drown it out with the television, flicking through static and late-night reruns, but even the voices on the screen bent into the rhythm of the lullaby. A laugh track pulsed in perfect cadence. A commercial jingle lingered too long on a note, reshaping itself into the tune that made his chest tighten. He slammed the remote down and pulled the blanket over his head, his breathing shallow, eyes burning with exhaustion. But even under the covers, he could feel it. Not just hear it, but feel it, like a second heartbeat echoing inside his ribcage. Somewhere across the hall he heard the faint clatter of tools, the buzz of machinery sparking to life. Rick hadn't slept either. By morning, Morty dragged himself into the garage, bleary-eyed and trembling. The place was unrecognizable. The shattered remnants of last night's devices lay piled in one corner, and in their place Rick had erected a tangle of new machinery, cords snaking across the floor like veins, humming softly. Blueprints littered the walls, not on paper but scratched directly into the concrete with chalk, frantic spirals of equations that wrapped around doorframes and up toward the ceiling. Rick stood hunched over the central device, a towering frame of metal coils and glowing conduits that thrummed with unstable energy. His hands were bandaged, fingers scorched and stiff, but he kept working, tools clattering as if he didn't even notice the pain. Morty swallowed, his throat dry. Rick, what is all this?" Rick didn't look up. Containment, disruption, call it damage control. His voice was hoarse, ragged, like he'd been screaming long after Morty had passed out. "That thing you saw last night, it saw you back, which means we're on the clock." Morty's stomach dropped. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as though afraid of being overheard. It wasn't just me, right? I mean, you saw it too." Rick finally turned, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. He didn't answer immediately, and in the silence Morty felt his chest tighten. At last Rick muttered, "Doesn't matter what I saw. What matters is it marked you, and once they mark you, Morty, they don't let go." Morty's knees went weak. He leaned against the workbench, his hands trembling. "Marked me? Like forever? Rick, you gotta fix this." "I'm trying," Rick snapped, slamming his tool down with a metallic clang. He ran a hand through his tangled hair, his whole body taut with frustration. "You think I want this? You think I haven't seen what happens when someone gets tangled with them? Morty, you're lucky you're still breathing right now." The weight of his words settled heavy between them. Morty opened his mouth to respond, but the faint hum returned before he could speak. It wasn't in the room, it was inside him, vibrating along his bones, tickling the edges of his teeth. His vision blurred as shadows deepened, stretching unnaturally long across the floor. The humming aligned perfectly with his heartbeat, and for a moment Morty couldn't tell if it was his body or the world that was pulsing. He clutched his chest, gasping. "Rick, it's happening again!" Rick spun, eyes wide. He lunged toward the machine and twisted a dial. A sharp wave of interference blasted through the room, rattling tools and flickering lights. The hum faltered, snapping Morty back into himself. He stumbled, sweat pouring down his face, lungs heaving as if he had been drowning. Rick caught him by the shoulders, steadying him. His grip was firm, but trembling. "You feel that? That's it trying to sync with you, to make space. It's not through yet, but Morty, it's patient. And once it's anchored in you, no machine I build can rip it out. Morty stared at him, panic rising. So what do we do? Rick hesitated, his silence worse than any answer. He looked at Morty not as his grandson, but as a problem he couldn't solve, a ticking fuse he couldn't defuse in time. Then finally he spoke, low and sharp.
We find the source. Cut it off at the root. If we can break the resonance chain before it stabilizes in you, we got a shot. Morty shook his head. The shard. Rick's gaze hardened. Not just the shard, that was a piece, a fragment, which means there's more. The words hit Morty like a blow. If one fragment had done this, if just one sliver of metal had almost torn reality open, what would happen if there were dozens? Hundreds? Rick turned back to his machine, flicking switches, cables sparking under his hands. We're going to trace the signal. That lullaby isn't just noise, it's a map. If we can ride the frequency back to its source, maybe we can shut the door before it swings wide enough to swallow us. Morty wanted to argue, to scream that he didn't want to go anywhere near that sound again, but deep down he already knew he didn't have a choice. The song had chosen him, and ignoring it wasn't going to make it stop. The machine roared to life, a beam of distorted light cutting into the air, splitting into fractal patterns that twisted and folded like origami made of energy. Symbols floated within it, shifting in time with the faint hum Morty still felt under his skin. He watched, hypnotized, as the patterns began to settle into a shape that looked disturbingly like a door. Rick pulled on his goggles and glanced back at him. "Gear up, Morty. We're going hunting." Morty's voice cracked. Hunting what?" Rick didn't answer. His jaw tightened, and for a moment Morty saw something raw flicker across his face. Fear, sharper than anything he'd seen in him before. The garage filled with the hum of the machine, louder now, overwhelming, wrapping around Morty's heartbeat until they were one. He closed his eyes and felt the pull deep inside, a thread stretching taut, tugging him towards something vast and waiting, something that had already seen him. When he opened them again, Rick was standing at the machine, hand hovering over the final switch. His voice was low, almost reverent. "Let's find the bastard before it finds you." The switch slammed down. Light swallowed the room, tearing them forward into the resonance itself. The light was not light in any familiar sense. It was a tearing, a soundless rupture that pulled Morty's body apart and reassembled it in beats that felt like music. He stumbled as his feet struck ground, if it could be called ground. The surface beneath him shimmered like glass that breathed, stretching outward in endless ripples. Above, the sky was no sky at all, but a churning veil of shifting symbols, the same shapes he had glimpsed in the machine's fractal beam, rearranging themselves as though spelling words in a language he almost, but not quite, recognized. Morty gasped, clutching his chest, his pulse racing against the low hum that filled the air. It wasn't just inside him now, it was everywhere, woven into the very fabric of this place.
The lullaby he had feared was no longer distant. It was the world's heartbeat surrounding him, pressing against his mind until he could feel every note as pressure on his bones. Rick landed hard beside him, stumbling but recovering quickly. His goggles glowed faintly, the lenses flickering with streams of data. He surveyed the expanse with a scowl. "Yep, just as I thought. Resonance nexus, whole damn plane stitched out of the signal." Morty blinked rapidly, trying to steady his breath. We're not in our universe anymore, are we?" Rick grunted, adjusting his wrist device. "Close. Adjacent frequency band. Think of it like standing inside the echo of a scream. Not the scream itself, but powerful enough to shred you if you listened too long." Morty winced, as the hum swelled, vibrating his teeth. "Rick, I don't think I can take this. It's too loud." Rick reached into his coat and shoved a small device into Morty's hands. It was a crude headset, wires fraying at the edges, the metal band bent out of shape. "Slap it on. Filters the worst of the resonance. Should keep your neurons from liquefying in the next 5 minutes." Morty fumbled it onto his head, the earpieces buzzing as they settled against his skull. The pressure eased slightly, though the lullaby still pulsed beneath it all, constant, patient. He breathed out, shaky. Better, a little. "But Rick, what is this place? Why does it look like music, turned into a world?" Rick's eyes narrowed as he scanned the distance. Shapes moved far out on the horizon, towering structures that might have been mountains or instruments, their spires rising like strings under impossible tension. Because it is music, or the rawest form of it. This is the architecture of their language, Morty. It's not just communication, it's construction. They build with it, they breathe with it. Every sound here is a brick in a wall you don't want standing. Morty shuddered, hugging himself. And I'm connected to this? Rick's jaw tightened. You're not just connected, you're tuned, which means... He trailed off, staring at Morty with an intensity that made his stomach flip. They can use you as an anchor. Before Morty could respond, the ground beneath them rippled violently, a wave of distortion rolling outward. The hum shifted into a sharp, dissonant chord that stabbed through his skull. Morty cried out, clutching his head, and for a moment the world flickered. Shadows swam through the symbols in the sky, stretching like long fingers toward him. Rick grabbed his arm and yanked him forward. "Move! We don't stand still here. Standing still is like ringing a dinner bell." They ran, each step sending tremors across the shimmering ground. Ahead, one of the towering structures loomed closer, a spire of crystalline strings vibrating with a constant, low thrumming. Rick skidded to a halt at its base, whipping out a scanner that glowed with erratic symbols. "This is it," he muttered, circling the spire. "One of the anchor points. They're using these to bridge into our universe. You see enough of these built up, you've got a doorway you can't close." Morty stared up, throat dry. The spire wasn't just vibrating, it was singing, the same lullaby woven deeper, richer, harmonized with layers that made his chest ache. His eyes glazed, and without realizing it, he took a step closer. "Morty!" Rick barked, grabbing him by the collar and yanking him back. "Don't listen, that's how it gets you." "But," Morty's voice cracked. "It's so familiar, Rick. It's like I know this song, like I've always known it." Rick's grip tightened, his face drawn. "That's not memory. That's programming. It wants you to think that, wants you to trust it." The spire's vibration deepened, the resonance spilling out like a tide. Morty staggered, his knees buckling as the lullaby swelled. Images flashed through his mind, an empty crib, a shadow leaning close, a voice humming soft and low. He couldn't tell if they were memories or lies stitched into his thoughts. His chest burned as though something inside him were trying to sing back. Rick cursed, pulling a device from his coat, a jagged metal rod with glowing edges. He slammed it against the spire. The impact sent a burst of static through the air, the harmony faltering for a moment before stabilizing again. "Damn it," Rick muttered, striking it again. "Signal's self-repairing. I need more power." Before he could finish, the ground convulsed. Shapes rose from the ripples, coalescing into forms that weren't entirely solid. They were tall, faceless figures made of vibrating lines, their limbs stretching like strings plucked too tight. Their bodies wavered in rhythm with the spire, humming in unison. Morty's breath caught. "Rick, what are those?" Rick's voice was sharp, urgent. "Guardians! Manifestations of the frequency, and they don't like interference." The figures advanced, their movements slow but deliberate, each step sending vibrations that cracked the glass-like ground. The lullaby swelled, twisting into something harsher, more commanding. Morty felt it drag at his body, pulling him toward them, urging him to surrender. Rick shoved a device into his hand, a compact emitter, buzzing faintly. "Point and trigger, Morty. It scrambles their coherence long enough to drop them." Morty fumbled, heart pounding, as the nearest figure lunged. He squeezed the trigger. A burst of jagged noise erupted, tearing through the air like shattered glass. The figure convulsed, its lines fraying before dissolving into static. Rick fired his own emitter at another, the garage echoing with distortion that clashed against the lullaby. The air shook, the spire trembling under the chaotic interference. The Guardians wavered, their bodies unraveling one by one. Finally the last collapsed, the lullaby faltering back into its steady rhythm. Morty stood panting, sweat dripping down his forehead, the emitter trembling in his grip. His ears rang from the clash of sounds, but the hum still pressed against him, steady and patient. Rick staggered back to the spire, his face pale but determined. He planted the metal rod into the ground and keyed something into his wrist device. Energy surged, climbing the spire, wrapping it in chaotic static. The lullaby fractured, splintering into dissonant notes until the structure itself cracked. With a shuddering wail it collapsed, dissolving into fragments that sank into the rippling ground. Morty gasped, falling to his knees. The pressure in his chest eased for the first time since they had arrived, the lullaby dimming, but even in the fading hum he could feel it, still there, still waiting. Rick knelt beside him, breathing hard. His voice was rough but steady. "One down, but there'll be more. Dozens more." Morty looked up, his face pale. We can't stop them all, Rick. Not if it's this big." Rick met his gaze, something fierce in his eyes. "Then we don't stop them all. We find the core, cut the song at its source, end it before it spreads." Morty swallowed hard, the remnants of the lullaby still echoing in his mind. He wasn't sure if the tremor in his chest was fear or if it was the melody still singing through him, louder now, as though it had heard the challenge and was answering back. Morty's legs still felt weak beneath him, his lungs straining to catch the thin, vibrating air of this place. The fragments of the shattered spire dissolved into the ground, leaving behind only widening ripples, as though the collapse had disturbed a pond without end. The lullaby no longer pressed as heavily on his skull, but it lingered, softer now, like a voice humming from another room. It wasn't silence, it was anticipation, as though the song were merely pausing to breathe. Rick stood tall beside him, hunched only by exhaustion, his goggles dimming as their feed flickered into standby. He studied the horizon where more crystalline towers shimmered faintly in the distance, their resonance glowing like beacons. His voice came low, ragged but resolute. "That was just scaffolding, Morty, a piece of a bigger architecture. If we're going to kill this thing before it finishes building itself into our universe, we need to head straight for the core." Morty swallowed, his throat dry. "The core? You mean the heart of the song?" Rick flicked him a sharp glance, the usual sarcasm gone. "Call it whatever you want. It's the frequency's control node, the first note in the chain. Wipe it out, and the rest of this nightmare unravels." But Morty's mind clung to the word heart. That was what it felt like they were trapped inside a living song, and somewhere out there, something pulsed with its truest voice. His chest tightened as though it already knew the way. He hated the thought, but he also couldn't shake it. They started moving, the glass-like ground humming beneath their footsteps. The horizon shifted with each step, distances folding strangely as though the world itself rearranged to confuse direction. Rick adjusted his wrist device constantly, recalibrating with muttered curses. Morty tried not to listen, tried not to feel, but every so often the lullaby slipped through the filter of his headset, brushing against him with an intimacy that made his stomach knot. At first, it was just a melody. Then words began to thread through, faint, broken syllables that tugged at something deep in his memory. Morty froze mid-step, heart pounding. He could almost hear a voice, soft, close, singing to him in the dark. A lullaby meant to soothe. His breath shook. Rick noticed his hesitation instantly. "Don't!" The word cracked like a whip. "Don't give it a foothold, Morty. It's not yours. It's just leverage." Morty clenched his fists, fighting back the warmth rising in his chest. What if it's not, Rick? What if these aren't just lies? What if it's showing me something real? Rick stopped walking, his face shadowed by the pulsing glow of distant spires. His voice came quieter, but harder. "And what if it's not? You think I haven't heard voices in here? Promises? Memories? This place knows what you want most, Morty, and it sings it until you break. That's not truth, that's a trap." Morty flinched under the intensity, but the song didn't loosen its hold. If anything, it grew more tender, curling in his thoughts like arms wrapping around him. He forced himself to move again, but the tremor in his steps betrayed him. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed in that warped expanse. Shapes rose and fell on the horizon, sometimes looking like towers, sometimes like figures too tall to comprehend, their outlines flickering with every step. The hum beneath their feet grew stronger, building into an undercurrent of rhythm. It was guiding them somewhere, even as Rick's device struggled to keep their direction straight. Eventually, the ground dipped, forming a vast basin. At its center rose a structure unlike the crystalline spires they had seen before. This one was larger, impossibly vast, its form neither tower nor mountain, but something in between. It pulsed like a colossal throat, vibrating in waves that shook the basin itself. From its surface rose harmonics that filled the air, spilling into the sky like ribbons of light. Rick exhaled through his teeth. There it is, the core, singing its damn heart out. Morty stared, his chest burning with recognition. The melody emanating from the structure was the lullaby in its purest form, no longer fragmented, no longer distant. Every note wrapped around him with suffocating familiarity. Tears stung his eyes before he realized he was crying. He didn't even know why. Rick shoved a stabilizer rod into his hands. Don't listen. Focus on the job. We drive this thing into overload, collapse its harmonics, and get the hell out. Nothing else matters. But Morty barely heard him. The song filled his head, whispering his name in tones Rick couldn't hear. It was calling him, not Rick, not anyone else, him. They descended into the basin, each step heavier as the ground vibrated harder, their bones rattling in rhythm. Guardians stirred at the edges, rising from the ripples as lines of light twisted into humanoid forms again. Their faces were blank, their bodies trembling with resonance. Rick was already firing the emitter, bursts of jagged distortion tearing through them. Morty tried to aim, tried to fight, but the lullaby was louder now, louder than the noise, louder than his thoughts. His vision blurred. He saw flashes, his mother's voice, his infant self curled in a crib, a silhouette leaning over him with a melody in its throat. He couldn't tell if it was real, if it had ever been real, but the pull was undeniable. "Morty!" Rick's shout cut through the haze. He realized too late that one of the Guardians had closed in on him, its limbs unraveling into strings wrapping tight around his arms. He panicked, trying to fire, but the trigger slipped. The lullaby filled him, urging him not to fight, urging him to let go. Then Rick was there, slamming his rod into the Guardian's chest. A burst of noise ripped through, unraveling it into static. He grabbed Morty by the collar, shaking him hard. "Snap out of it! You think it cares about you? You think it's your family? It's a parasite wearing your memories like a mask?" Morty's throat locked. He wanted to believe him. He really did. But the song felt truer than Rick's words. The core loomed above them, vibrating harder, as though sensing their presence. The lullaby swelled into a crescendo, shaking the basin. Morty staggered under its force, his headset sparking as it failed to filter the sound. He tore it off instinctively, gasping at the raw flood of melody. And for the first time, he heard it clearly, not just the notes, but the words. A name whispered between the lines. His name. Morty froze, every nerve alight. Rick's voice was distant, almost drowned out. "Morty, don't you dare—" But Morty was already stepping forward, drawn toward the throbbing structure at the basin's heart. He couldn't stop himself. He wasn't even sure he wanted to, because in that moment, the lullaby didn't feel alien, didn't feel parasitic. It felt like home. And the terrifying part was, he wasn't sure he wanted Rick to take that away. Morty's feet sank deeper with every step, as though the ground itself wanted to hold him in place, to keep him close to the core's pulsing light. The lullabies swelled in perfect rhythm with his heartbeat, and for a moment he thought maybe they were the same thing, that the song had always been.
Inside him, waiting, patient, until now. His arms hung slack, the stabilizer rod loose in his grip, his eyes locked on the structure ahead. It towered like an impossible cathedral of sound and light, every vibration carrying meaning he couldn't put into words. Rick's hand clamped around his shoulder, yanking him back with a force that nearly dislocated him. "Morty, focus!" His voice was a jagged blade against the smooth current of the melody, harsh and discordant, but grounding. "You let that thing inside, it'll hollow you out. You'll be nothing but an echo." Morty's lips trembled. He wanted to answer, to argue, but the lullaby was already answering for him. In his head, it whispered reassurance, drowning out Rick's words with warmth. It didn't feel hostile. It didn't feel manipulative. It felt like care, like being wanted, and that was more terrifying than if it had been cruel. Rick shoved the stabilizer rod back into Morty's hands, forcing his fingers tight around it. "We don't get second chances here, Morty. Either we drive that thing into overload together, or we end up as part of the choir." His eyes, sharp even through the exhaustion, bored into Morty's as if he could will the doubt away. But Morty wasn't sure anymore. What if the song wasn't lying? What if the fragments of memory it pulled weren't just bait, but truth? He could still see flashes when he blinked, his crib, soft shadows on the wall, a presence leaning over him with a melody too tender to belong to a monster. His gut twisted. What if the song was showing him something Rick had hidden? The Guardians stirred again along the basin's edge, more, this time, their bodies woven tighter, their movements sharper. They were learning. Rick cursed under his breath and primed his emitter, unleashing another burst that carved a jagged ripple across the battlefield. Morty tried to mimic him, raising his rod, but when he aimed, his hands shook violently. The lullaby didn't want him to fight. It wanted him closer, nearer to its heart. A wave of sound rolled out from the core, stronger than before. Morty doubled over, clutching his skull as the melody pressed against him, not just in his ears but in every nerve. He gasped as words cut clean through his thoughts. "Come home. You've always belonged here. You've always been mine." He staggered forward again before he could stop himself, steps dragging toward the pulsing structure. Rick darted in front of him, shoving him back with both hands. "Morty! No!" His shout cracked, more desperate than Morty had ever heard. "That's not your home. I'm your—" He cut himself off, jaw clenched, eyes burning with something Morty couldn't name. Rick lifted his emitter again, aiming at the core this time. "You're not listening, so I'll end this myself." Morty's heart lurched. Panic surged through him at the thought of the lullaby being silenced. Without thinking, he lunged, grabbing Rick's arm. "Wait! Don't—" Rick spun on him, face inches from Morty's, rage and fear colliding in his expression. "Why, Morty? Tell me why I shouldn't. You give me one reason." Morty's throat closed, words dying before they reached his tongue. "Because it feels like love. Because it feels like something I've missed my whole life." He couldn't say it, not to Rick, not when he'd spit it back in his face. Rick ripped his arm free, his hands trembling as he steadied the weapon, but the hesitation was there, just enough for the Guardians to advance. They surged from the edges, their bodies rippling into nets of sound that arced through the air. Rick fired in a wide sweep, tearing down half a dozen, but more kept coming, drawn by the energy building at the core. Morty's head spun. The lullaby was screaming now, a crescendo that filled the basin with blinding light. The Guardians weren't enemies anymore. They were instruments, their bodies strung with threads of resonance feeding back into the core. Everyone that fell reformed, threads snapping back into place. Rick growled, frustration breaking through. "We're running out of time." He grabbed Morty's wrist and dragged him toward the structure itself, weaving through the onslaught of Guardians. "If we plant the stabilizer at its root, we can still collapse it." But Morty barely heard him. His entire body thrummed with the song, each step closer, pulling him deeper into its embrace. The closer they came, the more it felt undeniable. This wasn't an enemy. This wasn't an infection. It was something older, something that remembered him when he was too young to remember himself. They reached the base of the structure, the surface rippling like liquid glass. Rick slammed the stabilizer rod into the ground, metal biting into crystalline matter. Sparks of distortion bled upward, shaking the harmony. The core shuddered, its song faltering for the first time. Morty screamed as the sound hit him, not in pain but in grief, as if something precious was being torn away. He fell to his knees, clutching his chest, tears streaming down his face. The lullaby clawed at him now, desperate, pleading. "Don't let him take me from you. Don't let him erase me." Rick gritted his teeth, fingers flying over the device's controls. "This is the only way, Morty. It's the only way to save you." Morty looked up at him, vision blurred. "Save me or save yourself?" The words slipped out raw, unfiltered. Rick froze for half a second, his expression faltering. The stabilizer roared, sending shockwaves through the basin. Guardians shrieked in harmonic wails, unraveling into ribbons of static. The core writhed, its glow fracturing as cracks spidered across its surface. The lullaby screamed in Morty's skull, splintering between love and anguish. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could do was reach for the structure, pressing his hand against the vibrating surface,
as though he could hold it together. The moment his skin touched it, everything went white. He was no longer in the basin. He was back in his crib, the air warm, shadows gentle on the walls. A figure leaned over him, face obscured by light, voice soft with song. He couldn't see who it was, but the melody was the same as now, the same as always. His chest ached with longing. The vision cracked apart as Rick's voice tore through the illusion, shouting his name, dragging him back. The white dissolved into shards, and Morty was kneeling once again at the core, his hand still pressed to it. The cracks in the structure widened, light spilling out in violent bursts. Rick pulled at Morty's arm, trying to drag him away. "It's going down! Morty, we have to move!" But Morty couldn't let go, not yet. The lullaby wasn't finished. It whispered his name one last time, softer now, fading. "You'll come back to me, you're mine!" The ground split open as the core began to collapse inward, dragging everything with it. Rick shouted again, voice raw with panic, but Morty barely heard. He was still caught between two truths, Rick's desperate grip pulling him one way and the lullaby's fading warmth pulling him another. The basin thundered with the sound of a dying song, and Morty realized with a shiver that no matter what Rick destroyed here, the lullaby wasn't gone. It was inside him now, and it wasn't letting go. The collapse began as a low, bone-deep tremor that rattled Morty's teeth and shook the breath from his lungs. The basin roared like a world splitting open, the core's light folding inward in violent spirals. Rick's grip on his arm tightened until it hurt, but Morty still clung to the structure, hand fused to its trembling surface as though it were the only anchor he had left. The lullaby inside him swelled one final time, not as command or temptation, but as something heartbreakingly tender. "You'll remember me. Even when the world forgets, you won't." Rick yanked him hard, shouting over the cacophony, "Morty, if you don't let go, it'll drag you under." Sparks of collapsing resonance lashed across the air, shredding the Guardians into unraveling strings of light that whipped past like torn banners in a storm. Morty felt himself being pulled in two directions, Rick's desperate strength hauling him back toward survival, and the lullaby's fading warmth begging him to stay. The core cracked open with a thunderclap. A wave of force blasted outward, throwing them both off their feet. Rick shielded Morty with his body as shards of crystalline matter tore through the air, searing the ground wherever they landed. Morty coughed and blinked through the dust, dazed, the lullaby still echoing faintly in his ears, even as the structure dissolved into itself, collapsing inward until nothing was left but a blinding, shrinking point of light. Then, with a sound like the closing of a door, it was gone. Silence fell. Unnatural, suffocating silence, broken only by the distant crackle of settling debris. Rick groaned, pushing himself up with effort, his face smeared with blood and ash. He glanced at Morty, eyes scanning for injury, then exhaled harshly in relief when he saw him still breathing. "You almost got yourself erased back there," he muttered, though the anger in his tone was thin, frayed by exhaustion. Morty sat up slowly, chest heaving. He could still hear it, faint and far, as though lodged in the marrow of his bones. The lullaby hadn't been silenced. Rick hadn't destroyed it. He had only driven it deeper. Morty pressed a hand against his chest, trying to steady his heartbeat. The ache that followed wasn't just fear. It was grief. Rick noticed, his gaze narrowing. "Don't start thinking that thing was some long-lost friend. It was a parasite, Morty. A weapon dressed up in nostalgia. That's what it does. It finds the gaps in your head and fills them with something sweet so you'll never want to let go." His words carried weight, the kind of certainty that comes from experience, but Morty couldn't answer. He didn't trust his own voice. They staggered to their feet, the basin around them now a ruin of collapsed stone and shattered resonance. What had once been alive with pulsing light was now nothing more than jagged shadows under a dead sky. But Morty's ears still hummed. He thought of the crib again, of warmth and shadow, of someone bending over him with a voice that felt like safety. Maybe Rick was right, maybe it was all lies, but what if it wasn't? The thought hollowed him. Rick adjusted the stabilizer, now burned out and cracked from the overload. "We're not done here," he said flatly. That was one node, Morty, just one. If this thing has spread deeper, we're looking at an entire system compromised. He spat to the side, his expression dark. And you can bet your ass whatever's behind it won't give up just because we smashed its toy. Morty swallowed hard, his throat dry. But what if it wasn't just, some machine or whatever? What if it really... He stopped when Rick's eyes snapped to him, sharp and warning. "Don't finish that sentence," Rick said coldly. "Don't give it that power. That's exactly how it worms its way in. Doubt, hope, doesn't matter which. It feeds on both." He turned away, starting toward the slope that would lead them out of the basin. Morty hesitated, then followed, his legs heavy, each step echoing with the lullaby's ghost. The climb was brutal. Ash and fractured stone gave way beneath their boots, forcing them to scramble hand over hand at times. Above them, the sky remained dim, as though the collapse hadn't cleared the corruption, but only buried it. Morty's breath came ragged, his chest still thrumming with the song's remnants. Rick moved with sheer stubborn momentum, cursing every slip and near fall, his determination the only thing that kept them pressing forward. By the time they reached the ridge, Morty collapsed to his knees, gasping. He looked back down into the basin. It was unrecognizable now, a scar in the earth, silent and hollow. But in his head the lullaby still stirred, quieter now, but constant. He shivered. Rick crouched beside him, expression unreadable for a long moment. Then he spoke, softer than Morty expected. "Listen, Morty. I know how convincing it felt, I know. But you need to get it through your head. Whatever you think you heard, whatever you think you remember, it's not yours. It doesn't care about you." He hesitated, a flicker of something raw crossing his face before he masked it again. "I care. That's why I'm here. That's why I pulled you out." Morty's chest tightened. He wanted to believe him. He wanted to let that be enough. But when he met Rick's eyes, he saw something there. Fear. Yes, but also guilt. Rick wasn't telling him everything. Morty could feel it, as surely as he felt the lullaby in his veins. He stood unsteadily, brushing dust from his hands. "Yeah, okay, Rick," he said quietly, though his voice didn't carry conviction. Rick gave him a long look but didn't push. Instead, he motioned toward the ridgeline. "Come on, we've got a long walk back to the ship." They moved in silence, the barren landscape stretching endlessly before them. Morty kept his eyes on the ground, but his thoughts were elsewhere, caught between two truths that couldn't coexist. If the lullaby was just a trick, why did it feel so real? And if it wasn't, why had Rick looked so afraid when Morty tried to say it aloud? As they walked, the silence began to change. At first, it was only in Morty's head, the faintest hum, too low to distinguish. But soon it thickened, curling around him like fog. The lullaby wasn't fading after all. It was gathering again, coiling beneath the surface, waiting for the moment Rick's guard slipped. Morty's hand twitched at his side. He clenched it into a fist, heart pounding as the song whispered again, soft and intimate. "You can't run from me, not even with him beside you. I am in you now, Morty. You'll come back. You always do." Rick kept walking, unaware, muttering calculations under his breath. Morty followed, his step steady but his mind unraveling. The lullaby hadn't been destroyed in the collapse. It had survived, hidden inside him. And for the first time, Morty wasn't sure if he wanted it gone. The horizon stretched endlessly, the silence heavy with things unsaid. Morty knew this wasn't over. The basin was only the beginning. The trek across the desolate plain stretched into hours, though Morty couldn't measure time in the normal way anymore. The landscape had no markers, just endless ash dunes and jagged ridges that blurred together into sameness. Each step felt heavier than the last, not only from exhaustion, but because of the presence growing stronger inside him. The lullaby no longer drifted faintly in the background. It pulsed, timed with his heartbeat, as if it had rewoven itself into the rhythm of his body. Rick noticed the lag in his steps and glanced back sharply. His eyes narrowed, calculating, but he didn't comment. Instead, he adjusted the broken stabilizer slung over his shoulder, muttering numbers under his breath as if solving equations could hold back everything unraveling around them. The silence between them gnawed. Morty wanted to break it, to ask why Rick had looked so shaken when he'd tried to speak about the lullaby, but the words stuck in his throat. The song whispered in that gap, a voice almost human, threading through his thoughts with unnerving intimacy. "Don't ask him. He'll lie. He always lies. But I won't. I've been with you longer than he has. Before him. Before all of this." Morty clenched his jaw, trying to shut it out. He stumbled on loose stone, and Rick grabbed his arm before he could fall. For a second, Morty saw something in Rick's eyes again. Concern, yes, but beneath it a flicker of recognition. As though Rick didn't just suspect what was happening. He knew. "You're hearing it again, aren't you?" Rick's voice was low, dangerous in its certainty. Morty froze, his breath caught. Rick tightened his grip. "Don't bother denying it. I can see it all over your face." Morty swallowed hard, guilt burning in his chest. "It's just echoes, Rick, like after images. It's not." Rick cut him off, shaking his head. "That's how it starts. First it's whispers, then it's songs, then one day you wake up and it's not you making your choices anymore. That's what this thing wants, to wear you like a skin." His tone cracked like a whip, but his eyes betrayed something softer, almost pleading. "You've got to fight it, Morty. You've got to push it out." Morty wanted to say he was trying. He wanted to believe he could. But the lullaby was already answering for him, stroking the edges of his mind with a soothing calm. "You don't need to fight. I'm not your enemy. He is. Look at the way he watches you, waiting for you to slip, waiting to cut you down the moment you become inconvenient." The thought chilled Morty, because it didn't sound entirely untrue. He remembered the hesitation in Rick's voice earlier, the guilt behind his eyes. If Rick knew more about this thing than he was saying, then what else was he hiding? They reached a ridge, the climb, taxing and sharp with jagged edges that tore at Morty's hands. At the top, Rick crouched, scanning the horizon. In the distance, faint and distorted by heat haze, Morty saw the outline of their ship, small, battered, but intact. Relief should have come, but instead he felt a tightening in his chest. The lullaby grew louder the closer they came, as though the ship itself resonated with it. Rick noticed too. His shoulders stiffened, and he swore under his breath, "God damn it! It's not gone, it's latched onto the systems!" He turned to Morty with sudden urgency. "When we get there, you stay behind me. Don't touch anything unless I say. It'll be waiting for you." Morty nodded weakly, but inside the lullaby laughed. "He thinks he can protect you. He doesn't understand. I'm already inside. I don't need the ship. I need you." The final stretch was grueling. Every step toward the vessel seemed to pull Morty deeper into the song, his senses blurring until he could hardly tell what was real. The ship loomed closer, its metal hull scarred but humming faintly with an energy Morty recognized too well. Rick stopped just short of the ramp, pulling a device from his belt. It sparked and whined, barely functional, but he used it to scan the entrance. "Yeah, just like I thought," he muttered grimly. "Resonance infestation. It's laced into the circuitry." He glanced back at Morty. "This isn't going to be pretty." Before Morty could ask what he meant, the ship's lights flickered to life, though no one had touched the controls. The air vibrated with the lullaby, no longer a whisper, but a chorus, wrapping around Morty in waves that made his knees buckle. Rick cursed, grabbing Morty by the shoulders. "Don't listen! It's baiting you!" But Morty's eyes were locked on the ship. He could see shadows moving within, indistinct figures bending toward him like phantoms, their mouths open in silent song. His chest ached with longing. He knew them, he was sure of it. They were family. Rick shook him hard. "Morty, focus on me. They're not real." Morty tore his gaze away, trembling, but the lullaby surged inside him, louder than Rick's voice, drowning it out. "You don't have to run anymore. You don't have to be afraid. Come back to us. You belong here, Morty, not with him." Tears stung his eyes. "Rick, what if they're right? What if it's not lying?" Rick's face hardened, but there was anguish behind it. "Morty, I swear to you, if you take one step onto that ship without me stopping it first, you won't come back. Not as you. That thing will hollow you out and wear what's left. Is that what you want?" The lullaby pressed against him like a heartbeat. The phantoms in the ship stretched out their arms, their movements achingly familiar. Morty's body leaned forward before he even realized it. Rick saw it and pulled his blaster, leveling it at the ship's entrance. "Don't make me do this," he muttered through clenched teeth. His hand shook, not from weakness but from the unbearable weight of the choice. Morty stood frozen, caught between Rick's desperate warning and the lullaby's tender pull. His heart pounded, his breath ragged. One wrong move would decide everything. The ship's lights flared, the song swelling until it consumed the world. Morty's hand rose slightly, almost of its own accord. Rick's finger tightened on the trigger. And in that suspended heartbeat, Morty realized the truth. No matter what choice he made, something would be lost forever. The air shivered, charged with tension, as Morty stood on the cusp of a choice that threatened to split him in two. The ship's lights glared, flooding the ridge in a spectral glow, while the lullaby thundered through his chest like a second heartbeat. His hand hovered, half reaching toward the phantoms within, while Rick's blaster hummed hot, its barrel aimed steady but trembling at the same time. The world seemed to hold its breath, and for a suspended instant, Morty thought everything, his future, Rick's, maybe even existence itself, was balanced on the edge of a knife. Then the ship answered for him. A surge of power roared through its hull, the ramp clattering open with mechanical force. The song became a scream and then a whisper, layering over itself in unnatural harmony. Figures spilled into view, not flesh and blood, but projections, outlines of people Morty felt he had once known. They staggered forward like memories given shape, each face blurred yet devastatingly familiar. The sound of them calling his name was unbearable. Morty swayed, his knees buckling as the lullaby coiled tighter around him. He could almost smell them, the warmth of a home he barely remembered, voices that promised he was not alone. His throat ached with longing. Rick fired a warning shot past Morty's shoulder. The bolt struck the ramp, scattering sparks, but the projections didn't falter. They simply flickered and advanced, their voices rising in a chorus that wrapped Morty's thoughts in silken chains. Rick cursed under his breath, shifting his stance. "Morty!" His shout cut like glass. "They're not your family, they're puppets. Shadows! Don't let it crawl any deeper!" Morty clutched his head, torn. The lullaby was no longer gentle. It pressed, relentless, insistent. "We are you. We are what you lost. Why do you trust him, the one who hides the truth? You remember the song because it was ours, not his. Come back, Morty. Come home." The word home twisted in his chest. For so long he had felt the absence of one. And now here it was, waiting, calling, promising. his eyes blurred, tears stinging. Rick took a step closer, lowering the blaster just enough to reach Morty with his free hand. His voice cracked with urgency. "Listen to me, Morty. You think I don't know what it's like? To hear them? To want it so bad you'd burn everything just to feel them close again? I know exactly what it's doing to you." His grip tightened on Morty's arm. "But if you give in, there's no coming back. That's not home. It's a grave with wallpaper." The words lodged deep, but the lullaby only surged louder, almost mocking. "He lies because he's afraid. Afraid you'll see what he did. Afraid you'll remember who sang to you first. Not him, never him." Morty's heart hammered. He pulled slightly from Rick's grasp, eyes darting between the phantoms and Rick's desperate face. He wanted to demand answers, to force the truth from Rick's clenched jaw, but the voices drowned him out. The projections stretched their hands toward him, shimmering, beautiful, terrible. Then the ship screamed. A violent pulse tore through its hull, knocking Morty backward. Rick shielded him with his body as the ground quaked beneath them. The lullaby fractured, breaking into discordant notes, as if the ship itself was convulsing under the strain of keeping its illusions alive. "Shit!" Rick hissed, dragging Morty to his feet. "It's unstable. It's trying to fuse with the core systems. If it does, this whole place is going to light up like a goddamn funeral pyre." He shoved Morty behind him and raised his blaster again, firing into the ramp. Bolts ripped through the projections, scattering them into shards of light, though each one dissolved with a final cry of Morty's name. Morty's chest felt hollow, ripped open by the sound. He stumbled forward, almost chasing after them, but Rick caught him again, gripping him hard enough to bruise. "Look at me! Not at me!" Rick's voice shook with something Morty rarely heard in him: desperation. The lullaby reeled, faltering for the first time. Its voices splintered, caught between seduction and fury. "He stole you! He cut you off from us! He'll do it again! Don't let him!" Rick gritted his teeth, dragging Morty closer to the ship's edge. "We need to sever it now before it spreads beyond the hull." He jammed a trembling device into Morty's hands, a crude stabilizer, cracked and sparking. "You remember how I showed you to overload a containment loop? You've got to do it. I can't aim and calibrate at the same time." Morty stared at the device, his palms slick with sweat. His mind was chaos, torn between the lullaby's pull and Rick's hard command. His fingers trembled on the dials. Rick grabbed his chin, forcing Morty to meet his eyes. "You trust me, don't you?" Morty's throat tightened. He wanted to answer. But before he could, the lullaby surged again, not in whispers this time, but in a violent rush of sound. The ship's frame glowed, energy arcing off its hull, and the projections returned, broken, distorted, their forms convulsing with rage. They howled Morty's name, not with love now, but with demand, clawing toward him as if to drag him bodily inside. Morty gasped, stumbling back, the stabilizer nearly slipping from his grip. His pulse roared in his ears. Rick shouted at him, but the words blurred. He could barely hear over the song, over the crack of the ship as it tore itself apart from within. In that storm of sound and light, Morty realized something horrifying. The lullaby wasn't just trying to lure him, it was feeding on him. Each hesitation, each ache of longing gave it strength. He felt it siphoning him, his thoughts, his memories, twisting them into fuel. "No!" The cry ripped from his throat, raw and shaking. He tightened his grip on the stabilizer, his fingers finding the dials by instinct. Rick's voice cut through the chaos then, guiding, counting, grounding him. Together they tuned the loop, forcing the device toward overload. The lullaby shrieked in fury, the projections clawing desperately, their voices breaking into static. Morty's hands shook violently as the stabilizer whined, building toward detonation. The song fought harder, trying to drown him in promises, in voices he yearned to believe in. But Rick's hand was over his, steady, firm, keeping him tethered. And then, with a final surge, the stabilizer overloaded. A burst of energy tore through the ship, shattering its projections, silencing the lullaby in a single cataclysmic note. The light imploded, leaving the ridge in sudden, crushing silence. Morty collapsed, the device falling from his hands, smoke curling off its ruined shell. His chest heaved, sweat dripping down his face, his mind reeling with the echo of what he'd nearly surrendered to. Rick knelt beside him, breathing hard, his hand still gripping Morty's shoulder. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence was fragile, like glass waiting to crack. Morty's heart still beat to the ghost of the lullaby, faint but lingering, as if some part of it hadn't been destroyed, but had only gone deeper inside. When Rick finally spoke, his voice was low, rough. "It's not over. That was just one piece of it." He looked at Morty, his eyes shadowed with something unspoken. "And it's still in you." The words hit Morty like a blow. His breath caught, his chest tightening with dread. Because deep down he already knew Rick was right. Morty sat hunched over the shattered stabilizer, his breath shallow and uneven, while Rick kept his grip on his shoulder like he was afraid to let go. The ridge still trembled faintly from the blast, the air acrid with burnt ozone, but the ship stood silent, its song extinguished, or at least that's what it looked like. In Morty's chest, beneath the hammer of his pulse, a softer rhythm lingered, an echo of the lullaby, muted now but steady, as though it had carved itself into the marrow of his bones. He pressed a trembling hand against his sternum, trying to will it away, but the faint vibration answered back. Not gone, never gone. Rick's eyes, sharp even in exhaustion, tracked the gesture. He didn't speak at first, didn't need to. The truth hung between them like static. The thing they'd fought wasn't finished. It had burrowed deeper, hiding inside the very person it had tried to claim. When Rick finally spoke, his voice was harsh, but not with anger, with fear. "You feel it, don't you? Like it's still humming in there?" Morty didn't answer. His throat was tight, his mind a tangle of denial and certainty. But the silence was enough of an admission. Rick swore under his breath, rising to his feet, pacing in tight circles like a caged animal. His hands shook as he adjusted dials on his gauntlet, scanning the wreckage for residual energy. The readings spiked and wavered, chaotic, but all converging on one source. Morty. "You've got to tell me the truth," Morty whispered, his voice cracking. Why does it know me? Why does it sound like?" His words faltered, but Rick knew what he was asking. Why did the song feel like home? Rick froze mid-step, his shoulders locking. For a moment he didn't turn, didn't breathe, as though every possible answer threatened to tear him apart. When he finally looked at Morty, his eyes were bloodshot, haunted. "Because it does know you," Rick said flatly. "Because you're not the first Morty it's tried to pull under." Morty blinked, his stomach twisting. The ground seemed to tilt beneath him. "What do you mean, the first?" "Rick, what the hell are you talking about?" Rick dragged a hand down his face, groaning low, as though the words cost him more than a fight ever could. "It's not just a song, Morty. It's an imprint, a weapon built out of memory, attachment, grief. It hunts for something soft, something it can thread itself into. And Mortis," he swallowed hard, "Mortis are perfect for it. You're built to crave belonging, to cling." Morty's chest burned. "So I'm just, what, prey?" Some experiment waiting to get eaten alive? Rick's silence was an answer in itself. The faint hum in Morty's chest pulsed harder, as though the lullaby was feeding off his fear, pressing its phantom comfort closer. He staggered to his feet, backing away from Rick. You knew this was inside me, maybe from the start, and you didn't tell me." Rick's jaw tightened, but his voice cracked when he shot back. "Because if I told you too soon, it would have had you. You think you're strong enough to resist knowing the truth? Look at you, Morty. You almost walked straight into its arms." Morty shook his head violently, his vision swimming. The projections, the voices, the touch of something he wanted so badly, was it really just a trap? Or was Rick hiding something worse? The song whispered faintly in the back of his mind, twisting Rick's words, painting him as the jailer, not the savior. "He keeps you weak so you'll never leave. He lies because the truth would free you." Morty clutched his skull, shaking as if he could crush the voice out. Rick reached for him, but Morty flinched back, almost stumbling over the wreckage. "Don't you get it?" Rick's shout was raw. "It's in you now. And if we don't cut it out, it'll eat you alive from the inside. That's not a maybe, that's a fact." The weight of his words pressed down like iron. Morty wanted to scream, to deny it, but even as he opened his mouth, the song inside him swelled, answering for him. The ridge seemed to pulse with it again, faint threads of light crawling from the ship's cracks, snaking toward him like roots reaching for their seed. Rick's blaster was up in an instant, but Morty raised a hand, not to stop the song, but to stop Rick. "Don't!" he whispered, voice shaking. "If you shoot, it'll tear me apart with it." Rick froze, breath hitching. His hand trembled around the trigger. Morty saw it then, the conflict tearing Rick to pieces. The scientist who had burned entire worlds without blinking was terrified, not of the entity, but of losing him. The lullaby seized on it, flooding Morty's chest with a warmth so sharp it almost hurt. "He can't protect you, but we can. We've always been here, waiting. Just let us in. Let us finish the song." Morty fell to his knees, his breath ragged. He could see them again at the edge of his vision, shimmering figures of people he thought he had lost, their faces blurred but unbearably familiar. His mother's laugh, his sister's voice, even echoes of his own younger self, all reaching, all welcoming. Rick dropped to the ground in front of him, grabbing his shoulders hard enough to hurt. His face was pale, streaked with sweat, his voice low and frantic. "Morty, don't listen, look at me. Just me, you've got to fight it, because if you give in, I can't pull you back. Not this time." Morty's lips trembled. "Then tell me the truth. No more pieces, no more lies. Why does it want me? What aren't you saying?" Rick's grip faltered, his eyes hollow. For the first time, he looked less like a man who had all the answers, and more like someone carrying a weight too heavy to drop. "Because, Morty, the first voice in that lullaby was mine." The world seemed to shatter in Morty's ears. The warmth in his chest convulsed, no longer comfort, but fire. Rick's confession rang louder than the song itself, cracking open a memory Morty didn't know he carried. A fragment of a younger self, lying in the dark, a song humming softly above him, words blurred, but the cadence, the timbre unmistakable. Rick's voice. His heart lurched, torn between recognition and betrayal. "You... what? You sang it. That was you?" His voice broke on the edge of disbelief and rage. Rick's eyes glistened with something he couldn't hide, a vulnerability Morty had never seen. "Yeah, once, long time ago. And something out there took it, twisted it, turned it into bait. That's why it sounds like home. Because it was." The song inside Morty flared violently, surging against his ribs like it wanted to burst free. He gasped, collapsing forward, the ground shaking beneath him. Rick caught him, swearing, trying to steady him, but the light was already crawling faster from the ship, answering Morty's heartbeat like it was a signal. Rick gritted his teeth, holding Morty tight. "It's waking up again. Through you this time. I'll stop it, Morty, I swear, but you gotta hold on." Morty's eyes rolled, the lullaby exploding inside his skull until he couldn't tell if it was a song, a scream, or both. His last thought before the world went dark was a single, terrible truth. He didn't know if he wanted Rick to save him, or if he wanted to let the song finish what it started. Morty's body went limp in Rick's arms, his head lolling as if the weight of consciousness had been pulled out of him all at once. But even unconscious, the song still throbbed inside him, louder now, clearer, as if his collapse had opened a doorway. The faint glow that seeped from the wreck's fractured hull brightened, veins of light crawling over the ground like roots seeking soil, converging toward Morty's chest. Every beat of his heart pulled the threads tighter, binding him to the ship. Rick's panic sharpened into fury. He hauled Morty closer, shielding him with his own body as though sheer will could hold the thing back. "Not this kid, not mine," he muttered, voice cracking. His gauntlets sputtered with error codes, unable to contain the readings, but the truth was plain to his eyes. The entity wasn't just in the ship anymore. It was in Morty, using him as the core of its revival. He laid Morty on the ground, gently, almost reverently, then staggered to his feet. His mind, raw with grief and terror, forced itself into motion, clawing through possibilities. He needed containment. He needed a purge. He needed... Rick froze, staring down at Morty's pale face. Number. He couldn't just build some crude extractor. Not this time. Every shortcut, every half measure would tear Morty apart with the parasite. If he wanted to save him, it meant walking into the song itself and cutting it out from the inside. The thought chilled him. Entering the song meant binding himself to it, risking the same fate, becoming part of its endless cycle of echoes. But Morty's fingers twitched weakly against the dirt, his lips parting in a faint, soundless murmur, and that was enough to decide. Rick yanked open a compartment on his belt, pulling out a cluster of shimmering shards, fragments of memory, transcoders, tech he'd sworn never to use again. They weren't meant for combat, weren't even meant for healing. They were keys to consciousness, bridges between minds. He jammed them into his gauntlet, soldering connections with shaking hands, building a crude neural gate. His throat tightened as he muttered, "If I'm wrong about this, kid, you'll never wake up. But if I'm right, maybe we both don't." He knelt beside Morty again, pressing the gauntlet against his chest. The song surged at the contact, humming violently as though it recognized the intruder. Rick gritted his teeth, keyed in the sequence, and let the machine drag him under. The world folded. The ridge, the ship, the scorched earth, all peeled away in layers until Rick stood in a vast, trembling dark. And there it was, the lullaby. Not sound, but structure, an architecture of memory woven into music. Towers of fractured light rose all around him, vibrating with notes that bent and shifted, voices threading through the void like rivers of glass. And in the center, Morty, or rather, Morty's shape, his silhouette tangled in strands of shimmering melody, his body suspended like a marionette in the glow. His eyes fluttered open, but they weren't his. They gleamed with the soft, merciless warmth of the song itself. "You came," the voices said through him, layered and tender, neither threatening nor kind. "Of course you did. You always do. You taught us the first verse, and now you're here to finish it." Rick's jaw clenched, his fists curling. Get the hell out of my grandson, you cheap knockoff symphony. You think you can twist my voice, my memories into this trap? You don't know a damn thing about me." The song laughed, or rather, it trembled, its notes vibrating with something like amusement. "But we do. Every loss, every regret, every cradle of silence you tried to fill with words you couldn't keep, you sang to him once when he was too small to remember. And that truth is ours now. He knows it. He feels it. Why do you think he reached for us?" Morty's face turned toward him, tears shimmering on cheeks that weren't really wet. "Rick, it feels real. It feels like you. Why would I fight something that's finally giving me what you never could?" Rick's chest caved in at the words, but he forced himself forward, step by shaking step, until he stood before Morty. "Because it's not me, Morty. It's the part of me that failed you, weaponized, and if you give in to it, you'll never know the difference." The threads holding Morty pulsed, tightening. His body convulsed with the pressure, torn between Rick's words and the lullaby's embrace. The voices swelled, almost pleading now. "Why suffer with him when you can rest with us? He'll only hurt you again. We never will." Rick's throat burned. He hated himself for hesitating, hated how much of the song's truth pierced him. But then he remembered Morty's laugh, the way he argued even when terrified, the stubborn grit that kept him alive beside someone like him. He raised his voice, cracking through the melody like static in a choir. "You want him because he's strong enough to feel what I couldn't, but he's mine, and I'm not letting you take him." With a roar, Rick plunged his gauntlet into the weave of light, ripping at the strands, binding Morty. The song shrieked, a discordant blast that shook the void. Morty screamed too, thrashing, torn between freedom and fusion. Rick held on, dragging him closer, each thread slicing into his own skin like wires of fire. "Listen to me, Morty!" Rick shouted over the storm. "I sang that song once. Yeah, but it was just noise without you. Don't let this thing convince you it's home. Home's not a lullaby. Home's—" His voice cracked, tears stinging his eyes. "It's us. Damn."
It's every fight, every mistake, every stupid adventure. It's messy and it's real and it hurts. But it's ours, you hear me? It's ours." For a heartbeat, Morty's eyes flickered, golden with the song, then wet and human. His lips trembled, a sob tearing free. The lullaby screamed, its structure shattering in jagged bursts of light. Rick dragged him free, clutching him against his chest as the void tore apart around them. The song's voices fractured, splintered, collapsing into a static hiss that faded into silence. And then the ground slammed back under Rick's knees, the ridge, the ship, the acrid air. Morty coughed violently in his arms, his chest rising and falling with shallow, human breaths. The glow had vanished, the threads gone, but his face was pale, his body trembling like something had been torn out of him and hadn't fully healed. Rick held him tighter, his own body shaking from the backlash of what he'd done. Morty's eyes cracked open weakly, searching. "Rick, was it really you, that voice, back then?" Rick swallowed, throat raw. He brushed Morty's hair back, his voice low, almost broken. Yeah, Morty, once, and I'll never let anything use it against you again." Morty's gaze softened, flickering between trust and doubt, but before he could speak, the wreck groaned behind them. The ground shuddered, a new pulse rippled through the air. Not the lullaby this time, but something deeper, older. The song might have been cut, but its source was far from dead. Rick's blood ran cold. He tightened his grip on Morty and staggered to his feet, staring at the trembling ship. "It's not over," he muttered, voice grim. "That was just the chorus." Rick staggered across the broken ground, Morty's weight slung against him like a fragile reminder of how close he'd come to losing him. Every step was a negotiation between exhaustion and stubborn refusal to stop, his knees trembling but refusing to buckle. Morty coughed once, the sound weak but alive, and that was enough to keep Rick moving. The wreck behind them wasn't quiet anymore. It was breathing like some colossal thing stirring in its sleep. A low tremor rolled across the ridge, deeper than sound, shaking the marrow in their bones. Rick lowered Morty against a jagged boulder, his hands trembling as he tried to steady the boy's head. Morty's eyelids fluttered, his voice a rasp. "Rick, still there. I can feel it like an echo in my chest. It's not gone." Rick gritted his teeth, glancing back at the ship. The hull split along its seams with wet, cracking sounds, spilling light that wasn't light at all. Too thick, too slow, bending the air like heat haze. It pulsed in time with Morty's breaths. Rick realized then that the bond wasn't broken. He had pulled Morty free of the lullaby, but the deeper root, the thing beneath the song, had embedded itself in him. "Yeah, kid," Rick muttered, forcing calm into his
voice. "I know it's not done with you, but guess what? Neither am I." The ship's carcass convulsed, plates of alien alloy folding inward as if sucked toward a singular point. Rick's instruments whined in protest, readings spiking off scale, but he ignored them. What rose from the wreckage wasn't just a structure anymore, it was a form. Limbs unfurled, not mechanical, not organic, but something that imitated both with unnerving fluidity. It stood on the ridge like a figure sculpted from broken reflections, faceless but aware. Morty's hand clutched at Rick's sleeve, his eyes widening in terror. "Rick, it's looking at me." Rick forced a smirk, though his gut twisted cold. "Yeah, well, it's gonna wish it hadn't." He drew his portal gun, hands shaking, but the weight of it felt useless against what loomed before him. He'd faced gods, tyrants, machines that thought themselves eternal. But this was different. This wasn't power clawing outward. This was memory clawing inward, trying to rewrite the past until nothing left was truly theirs. The figure's chest pulsed and the air rippled with a resonance that scraped the inside of Rick's skull. Morty winced, pressing his hands over his ears, though no sound came. Rick knew what it was, the lullaby stripped bare, not sung anymore but imposed, a vibration that demanded obedience. Morty began to convulse, drawn toward it like a magnet. Rick grabbed him tight, anchoring him, his mind racing for answers. "All right, think," he muttered, snapping a capsule from his belt. He crushed it in his palm, spilling nanites that swarmed into a crackling lattice around Morty, dulling the pull. The boy gasped, slumping slightly, but the figure only tilted its head as if amused. Then it spoke, not in Morty's voice, not in any voice, but in Rick's. The sound was jagged, fragmented, like someone had shattered his words and reassembled them into something crueler. "You taught us silence. You gave us hunger, and now you starve beside him, pretending you can protect what you abandoned." Rick flinched, the words clawing deeper than he wanted to admit. He swallowed hard, masking the tremor in his chest with anger. "Cute trick, but you're not me. You're just a parasite that figured out how to hum in key." The thing didn't advance. It didn't need to. The ground itself began to warp beneath them, the ridge softening into a surface of shimmering lines, rewriting itself into the architecture of the song world Rick had barely escaped. Reality was being overwritten, pulled into its design, and Morty was the anchor holding it open. Rick cursed under his breath. He couldn't just fight it here. Every second gave it more ground, more shape. His mind leapt through equations, scraps of forbidden tech, weapons too unstable to risk, all useless. The only chance he had was the bond it had with Morty, the same bond he'd used to pull him free before, if he could invert. It turned Morty from vessel to mirror. He might throw the thing back into itself. But doing that meant dragging Morty through the fire all over again. He crouched, grabbing Morty by the shoulders. The boy's eyes were glassy, already reflecting shards of the figure. "Morty, listen to me. I need you to fight it. Not just pull away, push back. Take everything it gave you and shove it in its face." Morty shook his head weakly, voice breaking. I can't. Rick, it's too much. It feels bigger than me, like I'll disappear." Rick's throat tightened. He wanted to lie, to promise it wouldn't happen. But he couldn't. So instead he squeezed Morty's shoulders harder, his voice cracking with something raw. "Then disappear with me. If it takes us both, fine, but I'm not leaving you in its hands, ever." Something flickered in Morty's eyes. Fear, yes, but also the stubborn fire Rick had seen in him 1,000 times before, the one thing that always surprised him. He nodded faintly. "Okay, just don't let go." Rick smirked through the ache in his chest. "Wouldn't dream of it, kid." He pressed the gauntlet to Morty's chest again, reactivating the neural gate. This time he didn't shield Morty from the surge. He opened the flood wide, letting the resonance pour into both of them. The world dissolved once more into the architecture of the song, but now it wasn't pulling them in. It was them dragging it open. The figure loomed above, its body stretching into infinity, a chorus of false voices shattering into screams as Morty's mind pushed back. Rick felt the burn of it, like glass tearing through every nerve, but he clung to Morty, amplifying his resistance, throwing every broken memory, every scarred regret into the current. "Take it, Morty!" Rick shouted, his voice nearly drowned in the cacophony. "All the pain, all the crap you think makes you weak, it's the only thing this thing can't digest. Shove it down its throat!" Morty's scream split the void, raw and human. The threads binding him reversed, snapping back into the figure's chest, puncturing it with its own design. Light shattered, voices collapsed into static, and the figure reeled, convulsing as the architecture buckled. Rick pulled Morty tight against him, shielding him as the song imploded, collapsing inward like a dying star. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that left scars, the kind that meant something had been broken in ways no one could fix. When Rick opened his eyes again, they were back on the ridge. The figure was gone. The wreck had collapsed into a husk, its glow extinguished. Morty lay limp in his arms, unconscious but breathing steady. Rick exhaled, a ragged, trembling sound, pressing his forehead against the boy's. "You did it, Morty. You shoved it back. His voice faltered, softer now. "You saved me too." But even as relief washed through him, Rick knew this wasn't the end. The lullaby was gone, but the echo remained. Morty had carried it, fought it, and some part of it had sunk too deep to vanish cleanly. He could feel it in the way Morty's pulse thrummed against his arm, like a note waiting to be played again. Rick held him tighter, his eyes fixed on the dead husk of the ship. His voice was low, bitter, but laced with grim resolve. "Round two's coming, and next time we finish the song." The air hung heavy, too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Rick sat with his back against the cold stone, Morty resting unconscious in his lap. The boy's chest rose and fell with steady rhythm, but every breath carried a faint tremor, a residual echo that Rick couldn't ignore. He stared at the husk of the ship in the distance, its once writhing shape, now nothing more than a collapsed carcass of alien alloy, but his gut told him it wasn't truly dead. Things like that didn't die, they waited. Rick reached for a flask tucked into his coat, but when he unscrewed it, his hand shook so badly he spilled half the contents on the ground. "Get it together," he muttered, forcing a gulp down his throat. The burn didn't calm him. Nothing did. His mind kept circling back to Morty, how the lullaby had threaded itself through him, how even now the faint pulse beneath the boy's skin wasn't entirely his own. Morty stirred, groaning softly, his eyelids fluttering open. His voice was weak, barely above a whisper. "Rick, is it gone?" Rick forced a smirk, masking the crack in his voice. "Yeah, kid, we kicked its ass, sent it packing." But Morty's brow furrowed, his hand lifted shakily to his chest. "No, it's still here. I can feel it, like it's waiting for me to fall asleep." Rick's smirk faltered just for a second. He cupped Morty's shoulder, steady and firm. "Then don't sleep yet. Not until I figure out how to drown the damn thing for good." The ground beneath them rumbled faintly, not violent, just a reminder that nothing here was stable. Rick helped Morty to his feet, slinging the boy's arm over his shoulder as they began the slow trek toward the ridge's far edge. The air was brittle, thinner than it should have been, reality stretched too tight by what had just unfolded. Rick's every instinct screamed at him to keep moving before the silence broke. They reached a plateau where his ship had crash-landed hours ago, scorched metal still smoldering. The vessel was half-ruined, stabilizers twisted, portal array gutted. Rick muttered curses under his breath, slamming a panel open and pulling wires free with shaking hands. He needed power, he needed escape, but most of all, he needed time to figure out how deep the echo had sunk into Morty. Behind him, Morty leaned against a broken strut, staring blankly at the horizon. His voice came hollow. "Rick, when I was in it, when the song was inside me, it didn't feel wrong at first. It
felt safe. Like I didn't have to think anymore, didn't have to be scared." Rick froze for a moment, knuckles tightening around the tools in his grip. He didn't turn. That's how it gets you, Morty. It gives you the easy out. Makes you think surrender's the same thing as peace. It's a lie. Always a lie. Morty swallowed hard, looking down at his hands as if they weren't his own. "But part of me still wants it back. Isn't that messed up?" Rick finally glanced at him, eyes tired but sharp. "Nah, it's human. Everyone wants the quiet. The trick's remembering that the quiet ain't free. You pay with yourself. And you're not for sale, Morty. Not to them." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then a low vibration hummed through the air, faint but undeniable. Morty's eyes widened. Rick dropped his tools, rushing to his side, scanning the boy with a handheld device. The readouts were fractured nonsense, frequencies folding over themselves, signals looping like recursive code. The echo wasn't dormant, it was adapting. "Son of a bitch," Rick hissed, tightening his grip on the scanner. "It's not just hanging on, it's rewriting itself through you." Morty's voice cracked. "So what does that mean? Am I turning into one of those things?" Rick's jaw clenched. He wanted to lie, to soften the blow, but the truth hovered, heavy between them. "Not if I rip it out first, even if I have to tear through half the multiverse to do it." Before Morty could reply, the husk of the ship in the distance twitched. A subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but Rick saw it. The collapsed carcass pulsed once, faint light leaking from the seams. The echo inside Morty resonated in response, his body jolting violently as if tethered to it. He cried out, collapsing to his knees. Rick dropped beside him, wrapping both arms around him to keep him anchored. "Stay with me, Morty. Don't let it pull you back in." Morty's eyes glazed, his voice fractured. It's calling me, Rick. It says I belong to it now. Rick's breath shook, but his voice rose sharp, cutting through the air. The only thing you belong to is yourself, Morty. You hear me? Not me, not that thing, yourself. Fight it! The boy's body convulsed, veins glowing faintly with the same unnatural light seeping from the wreck. Rick ripped a stabilizer core free from his ruined ship, jury-rigging the components with desperate speed. He jammed the device against Morty's chest, unleashing a surge of raw energy. The boy screamed, the glow flaring so bright it burned Rick's retinas. And then silence. Morty slumped forward into Rick's arms, unconscious again. Rick panted, sweat dripping down his temples, his hands shaking from the overload. He looked down at Morty, still breathing, but with that same faint hum running through his pulse. He hadn't purged it. He'd only bought them time. The husk in the distance stirred.
Again, louder now, its fractured shell vibrating like a drum. Something inside was reforming, rebuilding. Rick stared at it, rage tightening every line of his face. He whispered through clenched teeth, not for Morty, but for himself. You want him? You'll have to go through me, and I'll burn every last damn universe before I let you win. He carried Morty back into the broken ship, strapping him into a stasis cradle, locking it down with fail-safe codes even he barely trusted. Outside, the air began to tremble with a low chorus, faint, fractured, but growing stronger. The song wasn't gone, it had only retreated, waiting for the next verse. Rick leaned against the bulkhead, his flask forgotten, his eyes burning with exhaustion and fury. Round two's coming sooner than I thought, he muttered, then softer, almost to Morty. Hang on, kid, just hang on. The wreck groaned in the distance, the echo thrumming in Morty's chest like a ticking clock, and Rick knew the fragile calm wouldn't hold. This wasn't over. It was only the pause before the storm. The hum inside the stasis cradle was supposed to be silent, a sterile kind of nothingness that locked the body down and left the mind untouched. But Morty didn't wake to silence. He woke to a faint vibration threaded through his chest like the pluck of a string beneath his ribs. His eyelids fluttered open, heavy and unwilling, and for a moment he thought he was floating. The glass canopy above him shimmered faintly with protective fields, and beyond it he could see Rick moving in jerky motions, half collapsed against the console, wires spilling from the walls like veins ripped out of flesh. Morty tried to speak, but the cradle suppressed his voice, holding him in the shallow stillness between sleep and wakefulness. His eyes rolled back as the hum grew louder, threading words he couldn't understand into the space between his breaths. It wasn't the full song, not yet, but fragments of it, fractured verses crawling up from the husk in the distance. They weren't calling with force this time. They were whispering, coaxing. Morty's hands twitched against the restraints, not out of fear, but from the longing they planted inside him. Rick's head snapped up at the movement, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. He staggered over, slamming his hand against the side of the cradle, forcing the suppression fields to dim, just enough to let Morty's voice leak through. "Don't listen to it, Morty. Keep your head clear." Morty's lips trembled, his words broken. It's not hurting me, Rick. It's just telling me things I think I knew once." Rick gripped the edge of the cradle so tightly the metal creaked. His face hovered inches above Morty's, voice low and ragged. "That's not memory, Morty. That's it digging through you, dressing up its infection in something you'll accept. Don't mistake poison for medicine." Morty's eyes watered, though whether from fear or confusion Rick couldn't tell. He looked so small beneath the glass, pale from exhaustion, glowing faintly from whatever residue still pulsed through his bloodstream. Rick wanted to tear the cradle apart, pull Morty free, but he couldn't risk it. Not yet. He needed containment until he had a real solution. Behind him, the console spat sparks. Rick wheeled around, slamming commands into the system, cursing under his breath. He'd jury-rigged a loop to keep the stasis stable, but every few minutes the cradle tried syncing with the echo's signal as if it recognized a kinship. He was losing ground faster than he was gaining it. The husk outside shifted again. Not the slow twitch from before, but a deliberate ripple, its broken architecture lifting like a creature stretching after sleep. Light ran along its fractured seams, stronger now, building into a rhythm that matched the hum in Morty's chest. The resonance wasn't one way anymore. Morty wasn't just receiving, it was answering. Rick slammed a fist against the panel, teeth clenched so tight his jaw ached. "You son of a bitch," he hissed at the distant wreck. "You think you can use him as a relay? Not while I'm still breathing." He scrambled for the stabilizer core he'd overloaded earlier, rigging it into a crude disruptor. It was a weapon in the loosest sense, unstable, dangerous, as likely to blow a hole in the ship as to sever the connection. But time had stopped being an ally. He couldn't wait for clean solutions. The moment he armed the device, Morty's body convulsed inside the cradle, veins glowing brighter, his chest rising too fast. His voice cracked through the suppression field, distorted. "Rick, it says if you break it, I'll break too. That we're the same now." Rick froze, device clutched in his hand. His stomach dropped, the words hitting harder than any weapon could. Morty's eyes weren't pleading this time. They were calm, resigned, as if he believed the echo's claim. Rick slammed the disruptor down on the console, sparks bursting. "That's not you talking, Morty. That's it worming inside your skull. You are not the same. You're flesh and blood, and it's just noise dressed in a corpse. Don't you dare let it rewrite you." Morty blinked slowly, fighting to stay conscious. "But what if it's not lying? What if part of me is already gone?" Rick leaned over him, pressing his forehead against the glass, his voice trembling but steady. "Then I'll tear the part it stole out with my bare hands. I don't care how much it costs me. You're still you, Morty, and I'm not letting you slip away." For a moment, the hum dulled, almost as if Morty's heartbeat had disrupted the rhythm. But then the husk outside released a pulse, a wave of resonance that rattled the broken ship around them. The stasis cradles screamed with alarms, energy fields flickering violently. Morty arched upward, screaming as the resonance tore through him. Rick grabbed the disruptor, no longer hesitating. He shoved it into the core of the cradle, unleashing its unstable charge. The ship shook as the energy burst outward, slamming into the tether between Morty and the husk. For a heartbeat, Rick thought it might have worked. The glow in Morty's veins flickered, the husk's light dimmed. Then the feedback hit. The disruptor imploded, throwing Rick across the cabin, his chest searing with pain as he crashed against the bulkhead. The cradle's glass shattered, alarms wailing. Morty slumped forward, unconscious once more, smoke curling from the edges of the machinery. Rick dragged himself across the floor, blood dripping from his lip, reaching Morty. He pressed trembling fingers to the boy's neck. Still breathing, still alive. But when he touched his skin, he felt the hum deeper now, embedded not just in his chest, but threading through every nerve. The severance had failed. If anything, it had tightened the connection. Outside, the husk shuddered violently, tearing itself open, birthing something new from within its hollow frame. Tendrils of light arced outward, testing the air, searching. Rick pulled Morty close, shielding him as the ship's hull trembled under the pressure of the growing resonance. His voice cracked, fury and desperation bleeding together. "Fine, you want a war? You got one, but I'm not giving him up. Not ever." The husk's emerging form loomed larger, its light spilling into the sky, its song rising louder with every second. And within the fragile shelter of the broken ship, Rick clung to Morty, the hum in the boy's body sinking with the storm outside, a countdown neither of them could escape. The ship's hull groaned like an old wound forced open, the sound reverberating through the cabin, as if the metal itself were trying to tear free from its bolts. Rick pressed Morty tighter against him, his own body trembling from the blast's aftershocks. The air stank of ozone and burnt circuitry, smoke curling upward in lazy spirals as alarms bled into each other with shrill desperation. Outside, the husk continued to transform. It no longer resembled the inert carcass of some ancient structure. It was shifting with intent, pulling itself upright, its broken lattice knitting into something more deliberate. The fractured geometry realigned into spires of living light, folding and unfolding in hypnotic rhythms, as though the void itself had decided to grow bones and muscle. Rick's eyes narrowed, every instinct telling him that waiting meant death, or worse. He forced his aching body upright, dragging Morty toward the emergency interface. His boots slipped on the slick floor where coolant and blood pooled together, but he didn't let go. His grip was iron, as though the boy might dissolve if he loosened even for a second. The console spat sparks when he struck it with his elbow, its main screen barely holding. Together, he forced the emergency systems online, bypassing fried circuits with raw overrides. The screen blinked, stuttering, and then a schematic of the cruiser appeared, flickering with red zones that nearly consumed the entire vessel. "God damn it," Rick muttered, voice shaking between rage and exhaustion. "Hull integrity's at 40%, engines are shot, shields don't even exist anymore, but life support's still limping along, so hey, silver linings." He propped Morty against the console, brushing damp hair from the boy's forehead. Morty stirred faintly, his breathing shallow, but his body trembled in rhythm with the glow beyond the hull. Rick could see the pulse in his veins through his skin now, as though Morty's body was slowly becoming a conduit for the husk's signal. The transformation outside accelerated, its new form extending tendrils of light that lashed outward and pierced the vacuum like searching fingers. Each one left a ripple in the fabric of space, distortions spreading like cracks across a pane of glass. The song that accompanied it was no longer distant. It pressed against the hull, seeped into the walls, reverberated in Rick's chest cavity. He staggered to a cabinet and ripped it open, pulling free a battered injector gun. Slamming a vial into place, he crouched beside Morty and drove it into his arm. The boy gasped sharply, his body jerking as the stabilizing agent forced his nervous system into balance. For a moment, the glow dimmed. Morty's eyes fluttered open, glazed, but focused enough to find Rick. "Rick, it's awake," Morty whispered, his voice hoarse. Rick cupped the back of his neck, forcing his gaze steady. "Yeah, no shit, but so are we. And that means it's still got a problem." Morty's lips trembled, his voice breaking. It knows my name, Rick. It's calling me." "I can hear it even when I close my eyes." Rick swallowed hard, pressing his forehead briefly to Morty's temple, grounding himself in the reality of the boy's warmth. "Then don't close your eyes, Morty. Don't give it the dark to crawl into. Stay here. Stay with me." But even as he said it, Rick knew Morty's resistance was failing. The tether had grown stronger with every attempt to sever it. The husk wasn't pulling Morty into its orbit. It was dragging him into itself, reshaping him piece by piece. Another shudder ripped through the ship as one of the luminous tendrils finally made contact, brushing across the cruiser's outer plating. The metal screamed, melting into a liquid shimmer where it touched. Panels blew inward from the pressure, sparks raining down like meteors. Rick lurched back to the console, his hands flying over the manual controls. He didn't have engines, but he had thrusters, barely. Just enough to push the wreck away from the husk's direct grip, if only for a moment. The ship groaned as the thrusters fired, coughing the vessel sideways through the eag's void. The tendrils slid across the hull, cutting deep gouges but missing the heart of the ship. For now. Morty clutched his chest, his voice rising in panic. "Rick, it's pulling me harder. Every time you fight it, it just gets stronger." Rick slammed his fist against the console, pain flashing through his knuckles. "Then let it get stronger. I'll break it at its peak, Morty. You hear me? I'll burn it down while it's still showing off." But deep in his gut, he knew the bravado was thin. His mind was racing, calculations spinning too fast to pin down. Every solution ended in destruction, in collapse, in Morty being consumed. And still he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. The husk split open further, revealing a core within its reformed body. It wasn't just light. It was structured, deliberate, an engine of alien design pulsing with a rhythm too precise to be random. And in that rhythm, Rick recognized something horrifying. It was Morty's heartbeat. His eyes widened, bile rising in his throat. The husk had mirrored Morty completely, building itself around his rhythm, sinking its existence to his life. Killing it now might mean killing Morty too. Rick's hands trembled above the controls, hesitation clawing at him for the first time. No, you bastard. You built this around him. You think that means I won't burn the whole goddamn universe down to stop you? You don't know me." He tore open a panel, pulling free a cluster of unstable fuel rods, their glow searing his eyes. They were volatile enough to collapse the cruiser in a localized implosion, ripping everything within range into fragments of radiation. A suicide play, but one that might shatter the tether. Morty's weak hand caught his wrist, stopping him. His eyes were wet but steady, pleading without fear this time. "Rick, if you do that, you die too. And if you die, there's no one left to pull me back. Don't leave me here alone." The words gutted him deeper than any wound. Rick's vision blurred, his throat closing. He pressed Morty's hand against his chest, his voice breaking. "I'm not leaving you, ever. That's the one constant, Morty, even if the whole cosmos tries to rip us apart." Outside, the husk surged, tendrils striking again, each one resonating louder, the song swelling until the air itself seemed to vibrate. The cruiser buckled, systems failing one by one, the hull groaning like a dying beast. Rick jammed the rods back into the panel, rerouting their unstable charge into the ship's broken core. It wasn't an implosion anymore. It was something worse, something unpredictable. A distortion bomb that might not just kill them, but break reality open. His hand hovered over the final command, his face twisted with rage and desperation. He glanced once more at Morty, who clung to him, eyes wide, but trusting. And in that fragile trust, Rick found his decision hardening into something unshakable. The husk's light flared, Morty's veins pulsed, and the ship screamed on the edge of collapse. Rick slammed the command home, and the world convulsed in white. The white convulsion swallowed everything. For an endless moment there was no ship, no husk, no space, no sound, just blinding radiance that erased all boundaries. Rick felt himself stretched thin, like his mind was being unwound across a thread that had no end. Morty's grip on his sleeve was the only anchor, the only proof that he wasn't dissolving completely. Even that grip felt fragile, as though the boy's hand was nothing more than a memory Rick refused to let go of. Then the light cracked. Shards of it peeled away, falling into the void like splinters of glass. Rick gasped and realized he was breathing again. The ship was still around them, or at least something resembling it. The cabin was distorted, edges bending, surfaces twisting, as though reality itself had been kneaded like clay. Gravity flickered in waves, pulling them upward, sideways, then mercifully settling. Morty collapsed against him, shuddering, his veins still faintly aglow. Rick pulled him close, scanning the warped room. Alarms had died, the panels hung lifeless, yet some pulse deeper in the ship still hummed. It wasn't mechanical, it was something older, stranger. Beyond the fractured viewport, the husk was gone. Or rather, it wasn't gone so much as it was displaced. In its place hung a rent in space itself, jagged and bleeding light, a scar that writhed as though alive. From its edges spilled fragments of impossible geometry, shapes that tried to form, then folded back into themselves. It was a wound that had been opened too wide, and reality was struggling to close it. Rick staggered to the console, dragging Morty with him. The screens flickered with static, then coughed out half-coherent readouts. The coordinates were nonsense, distances inverted, timescales fractured. Wherever the distortion bomb had left them, it wasn't in the same universe they'd started in. "Great," Rick muttered, his voice a rasp. Traded one death trap for another. Classic Rick Sanchez problem-solving. Morty stirred weakly, his voice rough but audible. What? What happened? Did we win?" Rick looked at him, then at the wound outside, then back again. "Morty, that wasn't a win. That was hitting the reset button on a game that doesn't even have one. We're not in Kansas anymore. Hell, we're not even in physics anymore." Morty's eyes flicked to the viewport, widening at the sight of the writhing scar. He pressed against Rick, trembling. "It's still here, isn't it? I can feel it, like it's waiting." Rick clenched his jaw. He could feel it too. The tether hadn't broken. It had just been dragged along for the ride, coiling tighter with every second. Somewhere inside that wound, the husk had followed them, its shape dissolving and reforming in ways the human mind couldn't pass. It wasn't gone. It was becoming something new. The cabin shuddered violently as the scar outside flexed. A ripple tore through the ship, bending metal as though it were paper. Rick threw himself over Morty, shielding him as panels ripped free and floated. The pulse in Morty's veins flared in sync with the ripple, his body jerking like a puppet on invisible strings. "No, no, no, stay with me," Rick hissed, gripping his shoulders. "Don't let it take you." Morty's teeth chattered as he spoke. "It's inside, Rick. It knows I'm here. It's calling again." Rick's breath came hard and uneven. He was running out of tools, out of walls to throw between Morty and the thing that wanted him. But surrender wasn't in his blood. He reached into his coat, pulling out a fractured shard of tech, a dimension stabilizer half melted by the blast. It was useless for travel, but its energy signature could mask one lifeform if rerouted correctly. He pressed it against Morty's chest, wiring it directly into the stabilizer ports of the ship. Sparks bit into his fingers as he forced the connection. The device whined, its circuits screaming under the strain, but then a faint veil shimmered over Morty's body. His glow dimmed, his heartbeat slowed. Morty blinked rapidly, clarity slipping back into his gaze. "Rick, what did you do?" "Gave it static," Rick muttered. "If it wants to tune into you, it's going to have to get through a whole lot of white noise first. Should buy us time." But he knew it wasn't enough. He could feel the husk pressing against the veil already, probing, learning. It wasn't just calling Morty anymore. It was adapting. Rick turned back to the viewport. The scar was widening, its edges cracking further apart. From within, something began to emerge, shapes forming out of raw light, coalescing into limbs, spires, wings. It was building itself a body suited for this new realm, using the tether as its blueprint. Rick's stomach sank, It wasn't just after Morty. It was using Morty as the seed for its rebirth. The stabilizer sparked violently, threatening to overload. Rick yanked it free before it burned out completely, tossing it aside. He crouched to Morty's level, his voice urgent. "Listen to me. That thing out there, it's not just hunting you. It's growing out of you. Every second you breathe, it learns more, takes more. We've got one chance to cut it off before it finishes." Morty swallowed, his lip trembling. "Oh, how, Rick? How do we stop something like that?" Rick's gaze hardened, his voice cold with resolve. "We go in. We take the fight into the wound. If it's building itself out of you, then the only way to kill it is from the inside. Tear it down where it's weakest." Morty's face drained of color. You mean go in there?" He gestured at the writhing scar, terror flooding his voice. "Rick, that's not space. That's nothing. We'll be ripped apart." Grabbed his chin, forcing him to meet his eyes. "Morty, look at me. You're already being ripped apart. The difference is if we sit here, you don't come back. If we go in, maybe, just maybe, we make it out together. I'm not asking if you're ready. I'm telling you, I'm not letting you go." Morty's eyes shimmered, tears threatening, but he nodded, a shaky breath escaping him. "Oh, okay, Rick, okay. If you're with me." "Always," Rick whispered. He hauled Morty to his feet, dragging him toward the docking bay. The ship creaked around them, systems dying one by one, as if even the machine knew it was being led into oblivion. Rick armed what little gear he had left, stun grenades, plasma charges, a cracked shield emitter, and strapped them to his belt. As the bay doors peeled open, the void outside was anything but empty. The scar loomed, vast and shuddering, its light painting them in fractured hues. The new body forming within writhed, half-born, its song echoing across every nerve. Rick tightened his grip on Morty's shoulder, his jaw set like stone. "All right, Morty, we walk into hell, we burn the bastard down, and then we walk back out. You and me, that's the plan." Morty's voice was barely a whisper. "And if there's no way back?" Rick didn't hesitate. "Then we make one." Together they stepped forward into the tearing light, as the ship groaned and reality itself bent around them. The light swallowed them whole, and for an instant Rick thought there was nothing left, not of him, not of Morty, not of the ship. No gravity, no air, no space, no body. Just an endless suspension in a silence too perfect to endure. Then the silence broke, and reality slammed back, but not in any form that felt right. They were standing, or floating, he couldn't tell, on a surface that bent with every step, rippling like liquid, yet hard beneath their weight. The scar had not been a gateway to void, but to a realm between truths, a place built of unfinished thoughts. Around them, colossal towers rose and fell like breath, forming shapes, then melting into something else. Geometry folded inward and outward at once, angles that led nowhere, planes that looped in on themselves. And threading it all was the song, the same haunting resonance, now thunderous and close, weaving through every crack of the place. Morty staggered, clutching his head. "Rick, it's too loud, it's everywhere!" Rick tightened his grip on Morty's shoulder. His own ears rang, his mind thrummed like an overclocked machine. The tether wasn't calling, it was screaming, demanding. He forced his gaze outward, focusing past the noise. Ahead, where the distortion thickened, a shape loomed in its cocoon of light. The husk, unfinished but becoming, tethered to Morty's essence. It was vast, its body spilled across dimensions, limbs forming and unraveling in cycles, too fast to follow. At one moment it had wings like shattered glass, the next spires like cathedral towers. Faces flickered in its folds, echoes of people who had no place in Morty's life, yet were woven from the fragments of him. The thing was building itself out of everything he carried, his fears, his memories, his bloodline. Rick's stomach turned. The husk wasn't just reconstructing, it was rewriting. Morty stumbled, his knees buckling. Rick caught him before he collapsed. "Don't look at it, Morty. You look too long, it'll take more of you." Morty's breathing was ragged, but he nodded. His eyes, though, kept drifting back, caught like a moth to flame. The song pressed against him, familiar and unbearable. It feels like me, Rick. Like I'm supposed to be part of it. Yeah, well, screw what it feels like. Feelings don't mean jack when a cosmic parasite is hijacking your DNA for a makeover. Rick scanned the shifting terrain, his brain running calculations. They had to cut the tether here at the root before the husk stabilized. Once it finished building its body, it wouldn't just exist in this place, it would bleed back into their universe, dragging Morty with it. Rick drew out the last intact plasma charge, a volatile core rigged for maximum disruption. It wasn't designed to sever metaphysical umbilicals, but then again, most things Rick built weren't designed for what he used them for. He crouched, prying open the charge casing, rewiring leads with hands that shook despite his iron will. "We're going to take the fight to its heart, Morty. Burn it out before it finishes, but I need you to keep it distracted while I rig this. That means not giving in, not listening when it whispers. You with me?" Morty swallowed hard, trembling. What if it's stronger? What if I can't fight it? Rick's gaze softened for just a moment. He reached up, gripping Morty's face in both hands, forcing him to focus. "Morty, you're stronger than it knows, stronger than I gave you credit for. That thing's stealing pieces of you because it can't create anything real on its own. That means it's scared of you. So when it whispers, you scream louder." Morty's lips quivered, but he nodded. "Oh, okay, I'll try." Rick shoved the half-rigged core into his coat and rose, keeping Morty close. Together they advanced across the rippling surface, each step sinking and rising like walking across an ocean's breath. The husk loomed larger with every heartbeat, its form straining against the cocoon of light. As they drew near, the song sharpened into words, not quite human, not quite language, but Morty understood them. They were promises, a voice that spoke of safety, of power, of release from fear. It told him he didn't need to fight, that Rick couldn't protect him forever, that it could. Morty clutched his temples, screaming, "It's in my head, Rick! It won't stop!" Rick swore, yanking the plasma core free, fingers flying across its circuits.
"Then drown it out, Morty. Remember who you are. You're not its seed. You're Morty Smith. You're my Morty. Say it." Morty shook violently, the song clawing at every nerve. Tears streamed down his face. His voice cracked, but he forced the words out. I'm Morty Smith. I'm not yours." The husk's cocoon shuddered, light rippling outward in jagged waves. For a heartbeat, its unfinished form faltered, limbs dissolving back into mist. The tether recoiled, as though stung. Rick saw his opening. He hurled the overcharged plasma core at the cocoon. It struck, embedding in the writhing light. Sparks spat, energy bleeding in pulses. The husk shrieked, not with sound, but with force that cracked the ground beneath their feet. The cocoon writhed, splintering, but it wasn't enough. The tether reknit itself, drawing harder on Morty, siphoning faster. Morty collapsed, convulsing, the glow in his veins blazing like molten wire. His scream tore through Rick's chest like knives. Rick dove to his side, dragging him close. "Stay with me, Morty! Don't let it take you!" Morty's eyes rolled back, his body trembling. His voice came through in broken gasps. "Rick, it wants me to let go. It says it'll stop if I just..." Rick's grip tightened, fierce and desperate. Don't you dare! You let go, it wins. You let go, I lose you. And I am not losing you, Morty. Not here, not now. You hear me? The cocoon cracked wider, light spilling like molten glass. The husk's half-born body reached through, talons stretching toward Morty. Rick shielded him, his teeth bared, rage boiling. The plasma charge screamed as it overloaded, energy splitting into unstable bursts. Rick yanked a final device from his belt, an old stabilizer shard, damaged, unreliable. He jammed it into Morty's chest, forcing it to sync with his vitals. "If this kills me, you keep running!" Rick growled, though his voice broke under the weight of something heavier than fear. "But if it kills you, I'm burning this whole damn place down with us in it." The shard hummed, merging with Morty's pulse. For a second, the glow in his veins dimmed, the tether faltered. Morty's eyes flickered open, and through the pain, he met Rick's gaze. "I'm not letting go," Morty whispered. Rick's throat tightened, but he nodded. "Then neither am I." The plasma core erupted. The cocoon convulsed, light fracturing in all directions. The husk screamed, its unfinished body splintering, shards of impossible matter breaking away. The tether snapped back, thrashing like a wounded serpent, trying to reattach. Rick dragged Morty back as the ground collapsed beneath them, the world tearing apart under the strain. Through the chaos, Rick saw the heart of the husk exposed, a black core threaded with Morty's essence, glowing faintly, beating like a second heart. "That's it," Rick snarled, dragging himself upright. "That's the kill shot." Pulled a final charge from his belt, primed it, and hurled it into the exposed core. The blast tore through the wound, a cascade of light that devoured everything. The husk shrieked once more, then shattered, its body dissolving into nothing, the tether unraveling into silence. Rick wrapped himself around Morty as the explosion swallowed them. The last thing he felt was Morty's heartbeat against his chest, steady and real, before the world collapsed into blackness. Darkness lingered longer than it should have. Not the kind of unconscious void Rick was used to, where the brain simply cut the feed to spare itself the overload, but something thicker, like a place refusing to let them go. It wasn't silence either. There was a low hum, a pulse-like breath, echoing faintly through the void, as if the scar itself hadn't finished deciding whether to spit them out or keep them forever. Rick came to first. His body ached, but when he opened his eyes, there was no ship, no floor, not even a recognizable horizon. He and Morty drifted in a field of fractured light, pieces of broken reality floating like glass shards suspended in syrup. Every shard showed something. A memory, a possibility, a face. He saw himself holding Morty as a baby, though he knew it wasn't his memory. He saw Morty grown, older than Rick had ever let him be in any timeline, laughing with strangers Rick didn't recognize. Each fragment was alive, tempting, whispering. Morty stirred, groaning, clutching at his chest, where the stabilizer shard still hummed faintly. Rick tightened his grip on him, grounding them both. Morty's eyelids fluttered, then opened, wide and frightened. "Rick, where are we?" Rick scanned the warped expanse, jaw tightening. "Limbo, a buffer space. When we nuked the husk's core, it dragged us into the rupture instead of letting us walk free." He glanced at the shards of reality spinning around them, each one flickering like a lure. "And it's not just limbo, it's hungry. It wants us to pick. Step into the wrong fragment and you're gone, lost in a loop that ain't yours." Morty's face paled as he looked at the fragments, mesmerized. He saw one where his family sat whole around a table, Beth laughing, Summer not rolling her eyes, Jerry confident for once. His lips parted, his body leaning toward it unconsciously. Rick yanked him back hard. "Don't! You look too long, it starts working its hooks in you. None of this is real, Morty. They're just baits. Morty's voice cracked. But it feels real. Of course it does. That's how traps work. Rick pulled him closer, scanning the shifting void. We need an exit vector, something solid, anchored to our timeline. Otherwise, we're stuck. And trust me, you don't want to spend eternity in a kaleidoscope of maybes. The hum deepened, resonant and low, vibrating through their bones. The scar wasn't dead, it was regenerating. The husk was gone, but the wound itself
Was alive, adapting. Rick cursed under his breath. They had minutes, maybe less, before the whole structure collapsed and took them with it. He pulled a capsule from his pocket, his emergency temporal beacon. Its casing was cracked, half its circuits fried, but it still pulsed with a faint rhythm. He flicked it open, rerouting connections with trembling fingers. This'll find our home timeline if I can keep it stable long enough to punch through, but it needs fuel, an anchor strong enough to tell it what's real. His gaze snapped to Morty. Morty blinked, clutching his chest. Me? Rick nodded grimly. The stabilizer shard synced to you. You're already the tether it's been trying to leech off. We can reverse it, turn you into the signal that drags us home instead of the bait that keeps us trapped. Morty's voice wavered. And if it doesn't work? Rick didn't look up from his work. Then we dissolve here. Or worse. His hands stilled for half a beat before tightening around the beacon. But I'm not letting that happen. The void rippled violently. Shards of fractured memory began colliding, shattering into smaller fragments that swarmed around them like wasps. Each shard hissed with voices, accusing, pleading, promising. Rick gritted his teeth, shielding Morty with his body as the beacon's light brightened. Morty clutched Rick's arm. It's pulling at me again. Rick, it wants me back. His voice was strained, terrified. Rick forced Morty to meet his gaze. Listen to me, it's not you, it's never been you. You're not its seed, you're not its host. You're Morty Smith, and you're mine to protect. You got that? Morty nodded, though tears welled in his eyes. He shut them tight, gripping Rick's sleeve as though it was the only real thing left. The beacon surged, drawing power from the stabilizer shard. The fragments screamed as their light dimmed, the void convulsing. A pathway opened ahead, not a door, not a wormhole, but a thin corridor of steady light cutting through the chaos. Rick didn't hesitate. He threw Morty over his shoulder, holding the beacon high, and leapt into the corridor. The void howled, fragments smashed into the pathway, clawing at its edges, trying to swallow them back. Rick sprinted, lungs burning, every step feeling like it stretched miles. Morty clung to him, whispering, "Don't stop, Rick, don't stop!" Behind them, the hum built into a roar. The scar was closing. Rick pushed harder, but the corridor began fracturing. The beacon sputtered, its core glowing unstable. Rick cursed, forcing his legs to move faster. He knew the math. He wasn't fast enough, not without a push. He looked at Morty, who met his eyes with dawning horror. "Rick, don't you dare leave me!" "I'm not." Rick shoved the beacon into Morty's hands. "Hold it steady. It'll lock to you, not me. You're the anchor. You make the jump. I'll keep the
path open long enough for you to cross." Morty's voice broke. "No! You'll get stuck!" Rick smirked through the sweat and blood. "Kid, I've been stuck my whole life. You get to go home." He tore himself free, shoving Morty forward down the light corridor. Morty screamed, reaching back, but the beacon latched to his chest, dragging him onward. Rick turned, drawing every last weapon from his belt, firing into the collapsing void to keep the pathway from folding. The fragments tore into him, slicing, burning, but he held his ground, forcing the collapse back with sheer defiance. Through the chaos, Rick caught one last glimpse of Morty, arms outstretched, tears streaming, being pulled toward the light. Their eyes locked across the impossible distance. Rick's lips moved, unheard over the roar, but Morty knew the words. "I'm proud of you." Then the light swallowed Morty, the corridor sealing behind him. Rick turned to face the collapse, laughter bubbling up, ragged and broken in his chest. "All right, you son of a glitch," he muttered to the void. "Let's dance." The scar imploded. Light consumed everything.